Good evening. Tonight we're tracing the complete history of champagne, from the still wines of ancient Gaul to the luxury bottles popped at celebrations worldwide. It's a story that spans 2,000 years, centres on one French region, and reveals how an accidental fizz became the world's most prestigious drink. This is how a wine-making problem transformed into liquid celebration. You've seen champagne at weddings, New Year's parties, sports victories. You've watched the cork fly, heard the pop, seen the foam cascade down the bottle's neck. But champagne wasn't invented for celebrations. For centuries, those bubbles were considered a catastrophic defect, a sign that something had gone terribly wrong in the cellar. Winemakers fought against them. Bottles exploded, reputations shattered, and yet through a combination of geography, persistence, royal patronage, and sheer chemical luck, this flawed wine became the drink of kings. This is the story of how that happened. Foam face down, volume at a whisper, let's go in. The land before bubbles begin with the ground itself. Northeastern France, about 90 miles east of Paris, sits a landscape that seems unremarkable at first glance. Rolling hills, pale soil, winters cold enough to stop your breath. The region is called Champagne, derived from the Latin campagna, meaning plain or open countryside. The name suggests flatness, ordinariness, nothing special, but beneath those hills lies something extraordinary. A thick belt of chalk laid down when this land was an ancient seabed, millions of years before humans walked upright. The chalk is porous and soft enough to carve with a knife. It holds water like a sponge during wet months and releases it slowly during dry summers, keeping vine roots hydrated when they need it most. The soil drains quickly, preventing root rot. It reflects sunlight back onto ripening grapes, adding crucial warmth in a climate where every degree matters, and it imparts a mineral quality to the fruit, a crispness, a tension, a bright acidity that would one day become champagne's signature. This is not prime wine country by Mediterranean standards. It's too far north. The growing season is short and precarious. Frost can kill young buds in spring. Grapes struggle to ripen fully before autumn cold arrives. In warmer regions to the south, Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Rhone Valley, vines produce richer, fuller wines with ease. But Champagne's cool climate creates something different. Grapes with high acidity and delicate flavours. Grapes that retain freshness rather than developing heaviness. For still wine, this was often a disadvantage. For sparkling wine, though no one knew it yet, this would be everything. The Remy and the first vines, before Romans, before Christianity, before France existed as a concept, Celtic tribes controlled this land. The Remy were one such tribe, fierce warriors and skilled farmers who settled in the area around present-day Reims, sometime in the Iron Age. Ancient sources describe them as powerful and politically savvy, forming strategic alliances rather than relying solely on military might. Their capital, Durocotorum, would later become Reims, the heart of Champagne's wine trade. Whether the Remy cultivated wild vines or simply foraged for grapes remains unclear. Archaeological evidence is thin, but they knew the land, they understood its rhythms, and when the Romans arrived with their advanced viticultural techniques, the Remy were ready to learn. The Roman conquest of Gaul began in earnest in 58 BCE under Julius Caesar. The Remy, reading the political winds with characteristic shrewdness, sided with Rome early. They provided grain, troops, and intelligence. In return, they received favourable treatment, a degree of autonomy, trade privileges, and most importantly for our story, Roman expertise. Romans brought wine culture with them wherever they conquered. Wine was central to Roman life. religious ritual, social custom, daily sustenance. They planted vineyards across their empire, adapting Mediterranean grape varieties to local conditions. In the cool, chalky soils around Durac Cortorum, they established vineyards that would persist for 2 millennia. These were not the same grapes we associate with Champagne today. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Meunier, the holy trinity of modern Champagne, came later. The Romans likely planted varieties already successful in northern Italy and Germania, but they recognised that this particular terroir produced wines of quality, wines worth the effort of cultivation in such a marginal climate. By the 1st century CE, the wines of the Rheims area had developed a reputation. They were still wines, completely still, no bubbles whatsoever, wine, empire, and the bishop's blessing. As Roman Gaul matured, so did its vineyards. The city of Rheims grew wealthy from the wool trade and became an important administrative centre. Wealthy Romans built villas in the countryside, complete with private vineyards. Wine production expanded from small plots to commercial scale. The wines were light-bodied, acidic, pale in colour, characteristics imposed by climate and soil. They could not compete with the rich reds of southern Gaul or Italy, but they had their admirers. Then came Christianity. In 496 CE, a Frankish king named Clovis was baptized in Rheims by Bishop Remigius, also known as Saint Remy. This was not merely a personal conversion, but a political earthquake. Clovis's baptism aligned the Frankish kingdom with the Roman Catholic Church, consolidating power and establishing Rheims as a sacred city. According to legend, the baptismal holy oil was delivered by a dove, and Remigius prophesied that French kings would be crowned in Rheims for centuries to come. This prophecy held. For over 1,000 years, French kings were consecrated at Rheims Cathedral, and each coronation banquet featured the local wines. The association between Champagne's wines and royalty began here, rooted in religious ceremony long before anyone conceived of sparkling wine. Bishop Remigius himself owned vineyards. The church became the region's dominant landowner, carefully tending vines and improving techniques. Monasteries kept records, experimented with grape varieties, and perfected winemaking practices. Wine was needed for the Eucharist, the literal blood of Christ, so quality mattered spiritually as well as economically. But these were still wines, red wines mostly, light and acidic, perfectly acceptable for mass and feasts. No one wanted bubbles, no one was trying to create bubbles. The technology to safely create and contain carbonation didn't exist. Even if someone had accidentally produced a sparkling wine, it would have been seen as spoiled, undrinkable, dangerous. The Romans had introduced viticulture. Christianity had made it sacred. But the story of Champagne as we know it had not yet begun. The legacy of chalk and conquest. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, the Champagne region's wine industry was firmly established. Vines covered hillsides around Reims and Epernay. Techniques for pruning, harvesting, and fermenting had been refined over centuries. The chalk soil had proven its worth, producing wines with distinctive character. The Romans left, taking their legions and administration with them. Gaul fragmented into warring kingdoms. Trade routes collapsed, literacy declined. Yet the vineyards remained. The church maintained them. Local nobility protected them. The knowledge of winemaking, practical, empirical, passed down through generations, survived the chaos. This is not yet the champagne you know. These wines don't sparkle, they don't pop, they don't foam. They are ordinary in most respects, unremarkable to anyone outside the region. But the foundation has been laid. The right soil, the right climate, the right location at the crossroads of European trade routes, the connection to royalty and church, to ritual and power. All the ingredients are in place. They simply haven't been combined yet. That will take another 1,000 years, a monk with a reputation he didn't earn, an English obsession with bubbles, and a widow who revolutionised an industry. But all of that comes later. For now, the vines grow, the wine flows, and no one, absolutely no one, imagines that this region's future lies in making wine fizz. The bubbles are coming. They just don't know it yet. When Rome fell, the church remained. Across the fractured landscape of post-Roman Gaul, where kingdoms rose and collapsed with alarming speed, monasteries became islands of stability. They preserved literacy when secular learning vanished. They maintained agricultural knowledge when trade networks dissolved. And crucially, for our story, they kept the vineyards alive. The Benedictine order, founded by St. Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, established monasteries throughout Europe. Their rule emphasised ora et labora, prayer and work. Monks divided their days between religious devotion and physical labour, and viticulture fit perfectly into this rhythm. Vines required patience, attention, observation across seasons and years. The work was contemplative, it taught humility, and it produced wine for the mass. In the Champagne region, Benedictine abbeys became the centres of winemaking excellence. They had advantages secular winemakers lacked: institutional continuity spanning generations, literate monks who kept detailed records, wealth from donations and tithes to invest in improvement, and most importantly, time. A nobleman might plant vines hoping for profit within years. A monastery could wait decades to perfect techniques, knowing the institution would outlive any individual monk. The Abbey of Auvilla, perched on a hillside overlooking the Marne River near Epernay, was founded around 650 CE by Saint Nivard, Bishop of Reims. It would become the most famous monastery in Champagne wine history, though not for reasons people usually think. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That comes later. Wine, God, and commerce medieval monasteries didn't make wine purely for spiritual reasons. Yes, wine was essential for the Eucharist. Yes, it symbolised Christ's blood and connected the faithful to divine sacrifice. But wine was also valuable, extremely valuable. A monastery needed income. Land donations provided wealth, but land required management. Vineyards offered a perfect solution. They transformed property into a liquid asset that could be stored, transported, and sold. Wine didn't spoil quickly if handled properly. It could be aged, improving quality and commanding higher prices. It served multiple functions: sacrament, sustenance for monks and pilgrims, trade good, diplomatic gift. The wines of Champagne in this period were still exclusively non-sparkling. They were light reds mostly, made from Pinot Noir or similar varieties, pale in colour because the cold climate prevented deep pigment extraction. Some white wines existed, but red was preferred. These wines were acidic, delicate, nothing like the heavy reds of Burgundy or Bordeaux. They required careful handling and didn't travel well. But they had something, a certain finesse, a crispness, a refreshing quality that heavier wines lacked. In an age before refrigeration, when most wine was consumed young and slightly spoiled, Champagne's high acidity actually helped preserve it. The wines stayed fresher longer than their southern competitors. The monks of Auvilla and other abbeys worked continuously to improve quality. They experimented with different pruning methods. They tested various fermentation vessels, clay amphorae, wooden barrels, stone vats. They observed which hillsides produced better grapes, which exposures caught more sun, which soils drained better after rain. This knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from generation to generation of monks who dedicated their lives to perfecting their craft. They were not trying to make sparkling wine. That concept didn't exist. The goal was clear, stable, still wine that could survive transport and storage without turning to vinegar. The Dom Perignon problem. Here we need to address a legend that refuses to die. Ask most people who invented champagne and they'll answer Dom Perignon, a Benedictine monk at the Abbey of Auvila, who, upon first tasting sparkling wine, supposedly exclaimed, "Come quickly, I am drinking the stars." This is almost entirely fiction. Dom Pierre Perignon was a real person. He was indeed a monk at Auvila, but he didn't arrive until 1668, more than 6 centuries after the period we're discussing now. He was an exceptional winemaker who made significant contributions to champagne production, but he did not invent sparkling wine. In fact, he spent much of his career trying to prevent bubbles, viewing them as a flaw to be eliminated. The myth was created in the 19th century by champagne marketers who needed a compelling origin story. Dom Perignon fit perfectly, a monk suggesting purity and tradition, French asserting national ownership of the product, a clever, quotable legend about drinking stars. The story was too good not to spread. But we're in the year 700, then 800, then 900. Dom Perignon won't be born for another 700 years. The Abbey of Hauvillers is making excellent still wines, building its reputation, refining techniques. But sparkling wine is not on anyone's mind. Bubbles, when they accidentally occurred, were a disaster. They meant re-fermentation in the bottle, pressure build-up, potential explosion. Winemakers worked hard to avoid them. We'll return to Dom Perignon in his proper time. For now, remember, he's not the inventor. He's not even close yet. The real story is more complicated and more interesting. Kings, crowns, and consecration. In 816 CE, Louis the Pious was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rheims Cathedral. This coronation established a tradition that would last nearly 1,000 years. French kings would be consecrated at Rheims, the city where Clovis had been baptized 3 centuries earlier. Every coronation meant a feast. Every feast meant wine. And the wine served was, naturally, local, the wines of Champagne. This association between champagne wines and French royalty became deeply embedded in the culture. Kings weren't just drinking regional wine, they were consuming the wine of their consecration city, the wine blessed by proximity to holy ceremony. Champagne's wines gained prestige through association with power, but this created competition. Burgundy, 200 miles to the south, also produced wines served at royal tables. Burgundy's wines were richer, more robust, easier to produce in their warmer climate. A rivalry began that would intensify over centuries, sometimes playful, sometimes bitter, always about more than just wine. It was about regional pride, economic advantage, proximity to royal favour. Champagne had one advantage: geography. The region sat on major trade routes connecting the Low Countries to the Mediterranean, linking Paris to the Rhine. Merchants passed through regularly. Fairs were held in Troyes and other Champagne towns, attracting traders from across Europe. Wine flowed along these routes, building reputation beyond France. By the year 900, Champagne's wines were known to the nobility of Northern Europe. They were light, elegant, suitable for important occasions. They couldn't match Burgundy's richness or Bordeaux's power, but they had carved out their niche. Still wines, always still wines, clear, pale, delicate, no bubbles, the turn of the millennium. As the year 1000 approached, apocalyptic fervour gripped Christian Europe. Many believed Christ would return. The world would end. the dead would rise. Monasteries prepared for judgment. Nobles donated land to the church, hoping to buy salvation. The apocalypse didn't arrive. Life continued. The vines kept growing. The Champagne region entered the new millennium with an established wine industry built on monastic discipline and royal patronage. The wines had a reputation, not the greatest in France, but respectable, distinctive, tied to ceremony and power. The region's position on trade routes ensured steady demand. The church's ownership of prime vineyard land guaranteed quality control and continuity. Everything was in place for growth. The population was recovering from early medieval instability. Trade was expanding, cities were growing, demand for luxury goods, including quality wine, was rising. But Champagne's wines were still at a disadvantage. They were delicate, difficult to transport, unable to compete with Burgundy's reds on equal terms. They needed something to differentiate them, something to justify higher prices, something to make them special. They needed, though no one realised it yet, bubbles. The climate was already creating the conditions. Champagne's cold autumn temperatures often stopped fermentation prematurely, leaving residual sugar in the wine. When spring arrived and temperatures rose, dormant yeast would wake up and begin fermenting again, creating carbon dioxide, creating pressure, creating bubbles. Winemakers fought this. They wanted stability. They racked wine repeatedly to remove yeast. They sealed barrels carefully to prevent air from reactivating fermentation. They did everything possible to produce still, stable wine. But the bubbles kept coming, persistent, unpredictable, dangerous. For now, they remained a problem to solve. It would take another 500 years before someone would recognise them as an opportunity to exploit. The medieval period ends with Champagne established but not yet distinctive, known but not yet famous. The stage is set, the ingredients are assembled, the monks have perfected their craft. But the revolution hasn't started. The transformation from still to sparkling, from regional wine to global phenomenon, from problem to perfection, that's still centuries away. The wine is good, but it hasn't yet become champagne. The monks who carefully tended Champagne's vineyards in the early medieval period could scarcely have imagined what their region would become by the 13th century. By the High Middle Ages, Champagne had transformed from a collection of isolated monastic estates into one of Europe's most dynamic commercial crossroads, where merchants from across the known world gathered to trade everything from Flemish cloth to Italian silk, and increasingly the wines that flowed from the chalky hillsides surrounding Reims and Epernay. The great fairs of Champagne. The engine driving this transformation was an innovation in commercial organisation that would reshape European trade, the Champagne fairs. Beginning in the 12th century and reaching their zenith in the 13th, these rotating market gatherings created what economic historians now recognise as medieval Europe's first truly international marketplace. 6 major fairs cycled through the towns of Champagne: Troyes, Provins, Lagny-sur-Marne and Bar-sur-Aube, ensuring that for most of the year a major fair was always in session somewhere in the region. The fair's success rested on geography and political acumen in equal measure. Champagne occupied the crucial corridor between the manufacturing centres of Flanders and the financial powerhouses of northern Italy, making it the natural meeting point for Europe's 2 most prosperous economic zones. The Counts of Champagne, recognising the potential wealth such gatherings could generate, offered unprecedented protections to travelling merchants. Safe conducts guaranteed traders security on the roads. Special fair courts dispensed rapid justice for commercial disputes. Armed guards patrolled the trade routes. These protections were so reliable that merchants could travel with valuable goods knowing they faced minimal risk of banditry or arbitrary arrest, a remarkable guarantee in an age when most roads remained dangerous. Each fair followed a carefully choreographed schedule lasting roughly 6 weeks. The first week was devoted to the entry and setup of merchants. Then came specialised trading periods, 8 days for cloth, 11 for leather goods, 19 for goods sold by weight, including the spices, dyes, and luxury items that came north from Mediterranean ports. The final days were reserved for settling accounts, as merchants reconciled their transactions using the increasingly sophisticated credit instruments that the fairs helped develop. Letters of exchange, promissory notes, and other financial innovations that would eventually give birth to modern banking evolved here amid the cloth bales and wine barrels. Wine occupied an increasingly prominent place in this commercial spectacle. The Count of Champagne's own vineyards supplied the finest tables, but hundreds of smaller producers also sent their barrels to the fairs. Merchants from the Low Countries, perpetually thirsty for wine in their beer-drinking homeland, purchased champagnes, reds in vast quantities. English buyers, despite their own king's extensive holdings in Bordeaux, found the wines of Champagne fashionable and desirable. Even Italian merchants, hailing from lands awash in their own wine, recognised that Champagne's reputation commanded premium prices back home. The infrastructure of trade. This explosion in wine commerce created an entire supporting economy. Most crucial were the coopers, the skilled craftsmen who made the oak barrels that were, in this era before bottles, the only practical means of storing and transporting wine. Cooperage was an art requiring years of apprenticeship. The wood had to be carefully selected, properly aged, precisely cut, and expertly bent using fire and moisture. The iron hoops had to be fitted with mathematical precision. A poorly made barrel would leak, spoiling its precious contents and ruining a merchant's investment. The coopers of Champagne developed techniques that set standards across Europe. They understood that different woods imparted different characteristics to wine, French oak being preferred for its subtle influence on flavour. They knew that the level of toast applied when bending the staves could affect the wine's taste. They could calculate the exact curve needed for barrels of different sizes, from the small pièce barrels used for the finest wines to the massive foudres that stored reserve stocks in monastery cellars. Around the coopers grew an entire web of supporting trades. Blacksmiths forged the metal hoops and tools. Teamsters transported empty barrels to vineyards and full ones to market. Specialised merchants dealt exclusively in cooperage supplies. In the towns where the fairs convened, entire streets were given over to barrel making, the rhythmic hammering of coopers providing a constant soundtrack to commerce. The wine trade also demanded a complex logistics network. Wine could not simply be loaded onto carts and shipped at random. It had to be carefully protected from temperature extremes and vibration. Routes had to be planned to minimise travel time while avoiding the worst roads. River transport, when available, was preferred. Barrels could be loaded onto flat-bottomed boats and floated downstream with far less agitation than they experienced bouncing over medieval roads. The Seine and Marne rivers became crucial commercial arteries, their banks lined with docks where wine was loaded and unloaded. The triumph of Pinot Noir. During these centuries of commercial expansion, the vineyards themselves were undergoing a quiet revolution in grape selection. Medieval vignerons grew dozens of grape varieties, their vineyards often containing a jumbled mix of different vines. But gradually, through careful observation and selective propagation, certain varieties proved their superiority in Champagne's particular terroir. For red wines, which still dominated production, Pinot Noir emerged as the undisputed champion. This ancient variety, possibly cultivated since Roman times, showed a remarkable affinity for Champagne's chalky soils and cool climate. Unlike more robust grapes that produced heavy tannic wines, Pinot Noir yielded elegant reds with a finesse that aristocratic palates increasingly prized. The grape's thin skin made it challenging to grow. It was susceptible to rot in wet years and required careful handling, but the resulting wine justified the extra effort. Monks led the way in Pinot Noir propagation, applying the same methodical observation they brought to manuscript copying and liturgical precision. They noted which vines produced the best fruit, marked them, and propagated them through cuttings. Over generations, this selection process improved the quality of Champagne's vineyards, concentrating plantings of Pinot Noir in the areas where it performed best. The hillsides around A became particularly renowned for Pinot Noir, that produced wine of exceptional refinement. The white grape Chardonnay was also being cultivated, though it remained less prestigious than Pinot Noir in this era. Medieval tastes ran toward red wines, which were associated with strength, health, and vitality. White wines were considered lighter, more delicate, perhaps suitable for invalids or those of weaker constitution. This prejudice would persist for centuries, though Chardonnay's fortunes would eventually rise. Aristocratic consumption and royal favour. As Champagne's wines improved in quality and grew in commercial importance, they increasingly graced the tables of Europe's elite. Aristocratic consumption patterns in the High Middle Ages emphasized display and abundance. A noble household might serve multiple wines at a single feast, each course accompanied by a different vintage. The quality of wine one served announced one's status as clearly as the cut of one's robes or the number of one's retainers. The wines of Champagne, with their growing reputation for refinement, became markers of sophisticated taste. They appeared at royal courts from London to Prague. When nobles travelled, they brought Champagne wine with them, considering local alternatives beneath their station. Account books from aristocratic households show substantial expenditures on wine from specific Champagne vineyards, with prices that reflected both quality and prestige. The connection between Champagne and French royalty, forged when Clovis was baptised in Reims, deepened considerably during this period. The cathedral at Reims became the traditional site for crowning French kings, and the coronation ceremonies invariably featured wine from the surrounding region. After a king was anointed with holy oil and crowned before God and assembled nobility, he would partake of communion wine, wine from Champagne's own vineyards, blessed and served in the same city where Clovis had embraced Christianity 7 centuries earlier. This association with royal coronations imbued Champagne's wines with symbolic power beyond mere quality. They became tied to French national identity, to the sacred legitimacy of monarchy, to the continuity of tradition stretching back through the generations. To serve wine from Champagne was to invoke this heritage. For the region's producers, royal patronage provided not just prestigious customers, but a kind of sacred endorsement that no amount of commercial success alone could purchase. Guilds and quality control. As Champagne's wine trade expanded, maintaining the region's reputation became increasingly critical. A single merchant selling spoiled or adulterated wine could damage the good name that generations of careful work had built. In response, the medieval guild system evolved to protect both quality and reputation. Wine merchants formed guilds that established strict standards for their members. These organizations specified how wine should be stored, transported, and sold. They set rules about labeling and prohibited fraudulent practices, like watering wine or mixing inferior products with superior ones. Guild inspectors held the right to examine any wine offered for sale, and those found violating standards faced fines, expulsion, or worse. In an era when commercial regulation was minimal, guilds provided the structure necessary to maintain trust in the marketplace. The guilds also served social and religious functions. They organised feast days honouring their patron saints, provided assistance to members who fell ill or encountered misfortune, and ensured proper burial for deceased guild members. This combination of commercial regulation and mutual support made guilds central institutions in medieval urban life, and the wine guilds of Champagne were among the most powerful and well organised. Vineyard workers and cellar hands had their own organisations, though these possessed less power than merchant guilds. Still, they established standards for labour practices and helped transmit viticultural knowledge from one generation to the next. A young man entering the wine trade would serve years as an apprentice, learning not just practical skills, but the law and traditions of his craft. This system ensured that hard-won knowledge about grape cultivation, barrel making, and wine handling was preserved and refined over time. The cellars beneath Hauvillers Abbey held a secret that Dompierre Perignon wished desperately to eliminate. Each spring, as warmth crept back into the chalk caves where the abbey's wine rested, the barrels would begin to hiss and groan. Bungs would pop loose, sending streams of foaming wine across the stone floors. Bottles, those expensive new vessels that English merchants increasingly demanded, would detonate with the sharp crack of musket fire, their shards embedding in wooden beams and threatening any monk unfortunate enough to be working nearby. The cellars smelled of wine and danger, and the Benedictine cellarer found himself losing sleep over the mystery unfolding in his care. This was not how prestigious wine was supposed to behave, and in an age when Champagne's reputation rested on the refined, still wines served at royal tables, these violent fermentations represented not innovation, but crisis. The persistent problem of re-fermentation by the 15th and 16th centuries, the phenomenon that medieval vignerons had begun noticing, had become a predictable annual disaster. The cooling climate that characterised the Little Ice Age, a period of notably lower temperatures that gripped Europe from roughly 1300 to 1850, made Champagne's wine cellars brutally cold during winter months. Temperatures would plunge well below the point at which yeast could remain active, effectively freezing fermentation in its tracks, even though residual sugar remained in the wine. The winemakers understood fermentation only in practical terms. They knew that freshly pressed grape juice would bubble and foam energetically, that this process generated heat and produced wine, that eventually the bubbling would cease and the wine would clear. They knew that cold stopped fermentation and warmth encouraged it. But the underlying mechanism, the fact that microscopic organisms were consuming sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide as waste products, remained invisible to them. Louis Pasteur's revelations about yeast and fermentation lay more than 2 centuries in the future. What they could observe was the maddening cycle that repeated each year. Harvest would arrive in October, after increasingly anxious weeks spent praying that grapes would achieve adequate ripeness before autumn frost. The must would begin fermenting in vats, but as November's cold descended, the fermentation would slow and stop. The wine would appear finished, quiet, clear, ready for aging. Vignerons would breathe sighs of relief, thinking they had managed another vintage successfully despite the challenging climate. Then spring would arrive. As April warmth penetrated the cellars, the supposedly finished wine would wake up. The residual sugar that remained because fermentation had stopped prematurely became fuel for a second fermentation as dormant yeast roused to life. Carbon dioxide gas, which could escape harmlessly during the open-air fermentation in vats, became trapped in sealed barrels and bottles. Pressure would build to dangerous levels. Wooden barrels, for all their sturdiness, were never designed to contain pressurized liquid. Coopers had refined their craft over centuries, but their skills were directed toward making vessels that wouldn't leak when full of still wine, not toward creating pressure vessels. Hoops would pop loose, staves would separate, wine would gush out in spectacular fountains, soaking everything and everyone nearby. One account from a Reims monastery describes a barrel bursting with such force that it knocked a novice monk off his feet and sent the iron hoops clanging across the cellar like church bells. The glass revolution. The re-fermentation problem became exponentially more dangerous with the increasing use of glass bottles. Throughout the medieval period, wine had been stored and transported almost exclusively in wooden barrels. Glass bottles, while known since ancient times, remained rare and expensive, used primarily for serving wine at table rather than storing it. The bottles that did exist were thin and fragile, suitable only for short-term use. But during the 17th century, glass technology underwent a transformation, particularly in England. British glassmakers, experimenting with higher furnace temperatures fueled by coal rather than wood, discovered they could produce much thicker, stronger glass. The addition of lead oxide to the glass mixture created a material that was not only more durable but also possessed a brilliant clarity that made wine appear even more attractive. These new English bottles could withstand rough handling and long journeys, ideal for the wine trade. Moreover, they could be sealed with cork, a material that Spanish and Portuguese merchants had been using for wine storage, but which had only recently begun appearing in northern Europe. Cork, cut from the bark of cork oak trees that grew in Iberia, provided a far superior seal to the oil-soaked rags or wooden plugs that had previously served to close bottles. It was flexible, impermeable to liquid, and could be driven tightly into a bottle's neck, creating an airtight seal. For most wines, this combination of strong glass and effective cork closures represented simple progress, better storage and transport technology. For the vignerons of Champagne, however, bottles sealed with cork became potential bombs. The same secondary fermentation that merely damaged barrels could generate enough pressure in a sealed bottle to shatter the glass explosively. And unlike barrels, which usually failed gradually, bottles would detonate without warning. Dom Thierry Ruinart, whose family would later establish one of Champagne's great houses, described his family's cellars in the late 17th century. One must approach the bottles with great caution, for they shatter at unpredictable moments. The sound echoes through the caves like thunder, and the air fills with a mist of wine. We have taken to wearing iron masks fashioned by the local blacksmith, lest flying glass blind us. Some cellars reported losing 30 to 40% of their bottles each spring to these explosions. The financial losses were staggering, not just the wine itself, but the expensive glass bottles and the labour invested in filling and storing them. Cellar workers developed elaborate precautions. They would enter the cellars only during the coolest parts of the day, when pressure in the bottles was theoretically lower. They wore heavy leather aprons and metal face guards. They learned to approach bottles from the side rather than directly, minimising their exposure. Still, injuries were common. Nearly every estate had stories of workers scarred by flying glass, and at least one recorded fatality occurred when a bottle exploded directly into a worker's face. Dom Perignon and the art of blending. Into this volatile situation stepped one of the most famous figures in wine history, though the popular mythology surrounding him bears only partial resemblance to reality. Pierre Perignon was born in 1638 in Sainte-Menehould, a small town in the Champagne region. He entered monastic life as a young man, joining the Benedictine order, and in 1668, at age 29, he was appointed cellarer, essentially the chief winemaker and business manager, of the Abbey of Saint-Pierre d'Hautevillers, a position he would hold for 47 years until his death in 1715. The popular legend, fostered by generations of champagne marketers, claims that Dom Perignon invented sparkling wine, that he first deliberately created bubbles in wine, and that he exclaimed upon tasting his creation, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars." This makes for wonderful storytelling but poor history. In truth, Dom Perignon spent much of his career trying desperately to prevent wine from becoming sparkling, viewing the bubbles as a defect to be eliminated rather than a virtue to be pursued. What Dom Perignon actually achieved was far more subtle but equally important. He revolutionized the art of blending. Champagne's vineyards scattered across hillsides with varying exposures and soil compositions produced grapes with widely different characteristics. Some parcels yielded fruit with vibrant acidity, others with richer body, still others with distinctive aromatic profiles. Previous generations had made wine from these parcels separately or had blended them haphazardly. Dom Perignon approached blending with the methodical precision that Benedictine monks brought to all their endeavours. He tasted juice from individual parcels obsessively, noting their characteristics and how they evolved during fermentation. He experimented with different combinations, seeking blends that would balance acidity with body, that would produce wines more harmonious and complete than any single vineyard could yield alone. His systematic approach allowed him to create wines of unprecedented consistency and quality, even in years when climate posed challenges. He also implemented rigorous quality control measures. Grapes were sorted more carefully, with damaged or unripe fruit rejected. Pressing was refined to be gentler, extracting juice without crushing seeds or stems that could impart bitter flavours. Cellar hygiene improved dramatically under his management. Barrels were kept scrupulously clean, tools were maintained properly, and workers were trained in precise techniques. These improvements, rather than any single dramatic discovery, elevated Hautevillers wines to premier status. Regarding those troublesome bubbles, Dom Perignon did make one crucial contribution. He was among the first French vignerons to adopt cork closures systematically. Spanish merchants had mentioned cork stoppers to him, and he recognised their superiority over traditional closures. While cork didn't solve the refermentation problem, indeed by creating a better seal, it made bottles more likely to explode, it represented a necessary step toward eventually managing sparkling wine production. The irony is that Dom Perignon's wines, despite his best efforts, still often sparkled. The cold cellars of Hautevillers ensured that fermentation stopped prematurely almost every year, and spring warmth inevitably triggered refermentation. His real achievement was producing wine of such high quality that even with the defect of bubbles, it commanded premium prices and maintained Hautevillers' prestigious reputation. The English taste for bubbles. While French vignerons struggled against unwanted fizz, an unexpected development was occurring across the English Channel. The English, who had long been enthusiastic consumers of French wine, were beginning to appreciate the sparkling character that the French considered a flaw. Several factors contributed to English enthusiasm for bubbles. First, the English had a cultural familiarity with carbonation through their cider and beer traditions. Fizzy beverages weren't foreign or suspicious to English palates. They were normal, even preferred. When wine arrived from France with a slight sparkle, it seemed interesting rather than defective. Second, the English received champagne wine differently than the French. In France, wine typically went from producer to consumer relatively quickly, often arriving in early spring before significant re-fermentation occurred. But wine shipped to England faced a long journey, overland to a port, then by sea across the Channel. By the time it reached London merchants, spring had arrived. The wine would often be actively fermenting in its barrels, and when bottled in England using the superior English glass, it would continue developing bubbles. The 18th century brought profound changes to how Europeans understood their world. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, observation, and systematic inquiry transformed fields from astronomy to anatomy, from physics to philosophy. In the cold cellars beneath Champagne's vineyards, this new scientific spirit began reshaping an industry that had relied for centuries on tradition, intuition, and luck. The mysterious process that made wine sparkle was about to yield its secrets, though not all at once, and not without considerable difficulty. The chemistry of fermentation. The winemakers of early 18th century Champagne understood fermentation only through direct observation. They knew that grape juice, left in contact with crushed grape skins, would begin bubbling vigorously. They knew this bubbling generated heat. A vat of fermenting could feel warm to the touch, even in a cool cellar. They knew that eventually the bubbling would cease, leaving behind wine instead of juice. But the why remained mysterious, explained variously through theories involving the grape's spirit, the influence of lunar phases, or the action of invisible ferments, whose nature no one could describe. The first significant breakthrough came from understanding what the bubbles actually were. Natural philosophers, the term scientist wouldn't be coined until the 19th century, had been studying gases with increasing sophistication. In 1754, Joseph Black, a Scottish chemist and physician, identified fixed air, what we now call carbon dioxide, as a distinct substance. He demonstrated that this gas was produced during fermentation and could be collected and studied. This revelation was momentous for winemaking, though its practical implications took time to penetrate the industry. The bubbles weren't magical or mysterious. They were a specific gas produced during fermentation, and that gas had measurable properties. It was heavier than air, could extinguish flames, and crucially, could dissolve in liquid under pressure. When wine fermented in a sealed container, the carbon dioxide couldn't escape, so it dissolved into the wine itself. This explained why opening a bottle of sparkling wine released bubbles. The gas was coming out of solution as pressure dropped. French chemist Antoine Lavoisier in the 1780s conducted detailed studies on fermentation, demonstrating that sugar was being converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide. His careful measurements showed that the weights of the products matched the weights of the reactants. Nothing was created or destroyed, merely transformed. This quantitative approach allowed, in principle, for calculations about how much sugar would produce, how much alcohol and how much gas. But principle remained far from practice. Lavoisier's work was conducted in laboratory glassware under controlled conditions, not in the chaotic reality of wine cellars. The chemistry of fermentation involved not just sugar, transforming into alcohol and gas, but hundreds of other compounds interacting in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for another century. Different grape varieties, different temperatures, different yeasts, though no one yet understood yeast's role, produced dramatically different results. Moreover, most champagne producers lacked the education to understand these chemical revelations even when they heard of them. The vignerons who tended the vineyards and made the wine were craftsmen, not scholars. They learnt their trade through apprenticeship, not study. The gap between scientific understanding and practical application remained vast. Nevertheless, the knowledge slowly filtered into the industry through a few key intermediaries, educated merchants who read scientific journals, monks like Dom Perignon, who maintained scholarly interests, alongside their practical work, and wealthy estate owners who moved in circles where natural philosophy was discussed. These individuals began viewing winemaking through a new lens, seeing it as a process that could be understood, measured and controlled, rather than a mysterious craft requiring only tradition and intuition. Pressure and its perils. Understanding that carbon dioxide caused the pressure in bottles didn't immediately solve the practical problems that pressure created. If anything, quantifying the forces involved made the danger more apparent. Natural philosophers calculated that a bottle of sparkling wine might contain pressure equivalent to that found at considerable depths underwater, far more than the glass was originally designed to withstand. The exploding bottle problem remained the single greatest obstacle to reliable, sparkling wine production throughout the 18th century. Even with the improved English glass technology that had emerged in the previous century, losses ran appallingly high. Contemporary accounts suggest that in poor years, when conditions created especially vigorous secondary fermentation, half or more of a producer's bottles might shatter. Each explosion represented not just lost wine and broken glass, but potentially damaged neighbouring bottles in a cascading failure. Glassmakers and winemakers engaged in a technological arms race with physics itself. Glass manufactories experimented with ever thicker bottles, some becoming so heavy that handling them required considerable strength. The famous champagne bottle shape, with its sloped shoulders, substantial punt, the indentation at the bottom, and thick walls, evolved during this period specifically to resist pressure. But thicker glass meant higher costs, heavier shipments, and greater energy expenditure in the furnaces that produced the bottles. Cellar masters developed increasingly sophisticated protocols for managing the explosive risk. Bottles were stored lying down rather than upright, which distributed pressure more evenly. They were placed in specially constructed racks that would contain the damage if a bottle shattered. Temperature monitoring became obsessive. Cellars were equipped with thermometers, and workers tracked temperature fluctuations meticulously, knowing that even modest warming could trigger a cascade of explosions. Some producers experimented with adding sugar before bottling to control the intensity of secondary fermentation. This was dangerous work, requiring mathematical calculation and intuitive judgment in equal measure. Add too little sugar and the wine wouldn't sparkle sufficiently. Add too much and the pressure would shatter the bottles. The optimal amount varied depending on how much residual sugar remained from the primary fermentation, which in turn depended on how cold the weather had been during harvest season, how quickly fermentation had begun, when exactly winter cold had halted it, a chain of variables that made precise calculation impossible with 18th century knowledge. A widow takes charge. In 1805, an event occurred that would prove transformative for Champagne's development, though few recognised its significance at the time. Francois Clicquot, the son of a prominent textile merchant and banker who had established a wine business, died suddenly at age 30, leaving behind his 27-year-old widow, Barbara Nicole Ponsardin Clicquot, and their young daughter. In an era when women were legally barred from most commercial activities and socially discouraged from all of them, Barb Nicole faced a stark choice: remarry and cede control of the business, or attempt something almost unprecedented, taking direct control of a commercial wine house as its chief executive. She chose the latter, convincing her father-in-law, Philippe Clicquot-Muiron, to allow her to run the company. It was an audacious decision. The business of making and selling champagne was complex, highly competitive, and physically demanding. It required managing vineyards and cellars, dealing with often difficult suppliers and customers, navigating international trade, during the tumultuous Napoleonic Wars and solving the myriad technical problems that plagued sparkling wine production. Veuve Clicquot, Widow Clicquot, the name by which she would become known professionally and eventually to history, proved more than equal to these challenges. She possessed a rare combination of commercial acumen, technical curiosity, and absolute determination. Where others saw problems, she saw puzzles to be solved. Where tradition dictated one approach, she was willing to experiment with alternatives if logic suggested they might work better. The business she inherited faced serious quality control issues, particularly regarding clarity. Champagne, after its second fermentation, was cloudy with dead yeast cells and other sediment. The wine needed to be clear. Cloudiness suggested inferior quality and was aesthetically unpleasant. The traditional solution was to decant the wine into a fresh bottle, leaving the sediment behind, but this caused most of the bubbles to escape. Producers who wanted to maintain sparkle had to sell cloudy wine, accepting the quality perception problem this created. Other vignerons had experimented with various solutions. Some tried filtering the wine, but this too released most of the carbon dioxide. Others attempted to settle the sediment by storing bottles at various angles, with mixed success. The yeast and other particles were stubborn, taking months or even years to settle fully, and even then would often remain suspended rather than collecting in a removable deposit. The innovation of riddling Veuve Clicquot attacked this problem with systematic determination. According to accounts from her cellarmaster, Antoine de Muller, she spent hours in the cellars studying how sediment behaved in bottles stored at different angles. She observed that sediment would slowly migrate along the glass following gravity, but would often stick to the sides of the bottle or settle in a broad layer rather than collecting in a concentrated deposit at the cork. The breakthrough came around 1816, though like many innovations, it was refined through years of trial and error. The solution was a process called remuage in French, or riddling in English. Heavy wooden racks were constructed with angled holes cut into them, each hole sized to hold a bottle by its neck. Bottles were placed in these holes neck down at a slight angle, perhaps 15 degrees from horizontal. Each day, skilled workers would visit the racks and perform a precise manipulation. They would grasp each bottle, give it a slight shake to loosen any sediment stuck to the glass, rotate it a fraction of a turn, and return it to its hole, but at a slightly steeper angle. This process was repeated daily over the course of weeks. Gradually, the bottles moved from nearly horizontal to completely vertical, neck down. And gradually, the combination of rotation, vibration, and increasing angle caused all the sediment to migrate down the neck and collect in a compact deposit right against the cork. Once the riddling process was complete, the bottles were ready for dégorgement, disgorging. A skilled worker would quickly remove the cork, allowing the pressure inside the bottle to forcefully expel the small plug of sediment, then immediately replace the cork. Some wine was lost in the process, but the remaining wine was brilliantly clear and fully sparkling. The final step was adding a dosage, a small amount of wine mixed with sugar, to replace the lost liquid and adjust the wine's sweetness to the desired level. The riddling process was labour-intensive and required considerable skill. The workers who performed remuage, called remueurs, developed extraordinary hand strength and precise muscle memory. An experienced remueur could riddle up to 40,000 bottles per day, giving each the exact shake and twist it needed without conscious thought. But the results justified the effort. For the first time, champagne could be both brilliantly clear and fully sparkling. The 19th century arrived in Champagne with the rhythmic sound of innovation, the clatter of mechanized riddling machines, the hiss of steam-powered presses, the rumble of railroad cars carrying millions of bottles toward distant markets. What had been a craft practiced in ancient chalk cellars by skilled artisans was being transformed into an industry measured in statistics, driven by machinery and organised on a scale that would have seemed fantastical to the cellar masters of previous generations. The transformation would not be smooth, nor would it come without crisis, but by century's end, champagne would emerge as one of France's most important export industries and a global symbol of prosperity and celebration. The mechanisation of production. The early decades of the 19th century saw champagne houses grow from modest operations into substantial enterprises. This growth created problems that craft methods simply couldn't solve at scale. When a house produced a few thousand bottles annually, hand riddling was perfectly adequate. Skilled workers could manage the entire production with time to spare. But when production reached tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bottles, the labour requirements became astronomical. The riddling process that Veuve Clicquot had pioneered remained fundamentally unchanged for decades because it worked so well. But it was excruciatingly slow and labour intensive. Each bottle required daily attention for 6 to 8 weeks, and even the most skilled remuer could handle only so many bottles per day. As champagne houses expanded production to meet growing demand, the cellars filled with workers twisting bottles in endless repetition. Inventors and industrialists saw opportunity in this bottleneck. Throughout the mid-1800s, various mechanised riddling systems were proposed and tested. Early attempts were crude, mechanical arms that would shake and rotate bottles on schedules, water-powered systems that used hydraulic pressure to agitate bottles, even steam-powered contraptions that promised to revolutionise the process entirely. Most of these early machines failed spectacularly. They broke bottles, didn't settle sediment properly, or required so much maintenance that they proved more expensive than hand labour. The problem was that riddling required not just mechanical motion, but subtle judgment. Each bottle might need slightly different treatment depending on how the sediment was behaving, and the traditional remuers could adjust their technique intuitively in ways that fixed machines could not. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that truly effective mechanised riddling would arrive with the gyro palette, a large cage holding hundreds of bottles that could be programmed to execute the precise sequence of movements that remuers performed by hand. But throughout the 19th century, incremental improvements in rack design, bottle handling and cellar organisation did allow productivity to increase significantly even without fundamental mechanisation. Disgorgement, the process of expelling the sediment plug after riddling, saw earlier mechanisation success. In the 1880s, the technique of freezing the bottleneck in a brine solution was developed. The frozen plug of wine and sediment could be removed more cleanly than the traditional method of quick cork removal, reducing losses and improving consistency. Workers would plunge bottlenecks into a solution chilled to well below freezing, wait for the contents to freeze solid, then remove the cork. The pressure inside the bottle would eject the frozen plug of sediment cleanly, leaving clear wine behind. This innovation, while seemingly simple, transformed efficiency. Disgorgement had been one of the most skilled and wasteful steps in production. Even expert workers lost significant wine with each bottle, and the variation in how much was lost made it difficult to calculate dosage precisely. Freezing the neck standardised the process, reduced losses, and allowed for more accurate dosage additions. The revolution in glass. Perhaps no single technological advancement was more crucial to champagne's industrial expansion than improvements in glass manufacturing. The thick, hand-blown bottles of the 18th century were expensive, heavy, and inconsistent. Each bottle was slightly different, with variations in wall thickness that made predicting which bottles would withstand pressure essentially impossible. Producers had to overbuild, making bottles far thicker than most needed, to ensure that even the weakest bottles in a batch could survive. The development of the bottle-making machine transformed this calculus. In 1821, Henry Ricketts patented a process in England for using moulds to produce bottles of consistent shape and thickness. This semi-automated process spread gradually across Europe, reaching French glass manufactories by mid-century. By the 1880s, fully automated bottle-making machines could produce hundreds of identical bottles per hour, each one precisely conforming to specifications. This consistency was revolutionary for champagne producers. When every bottle had the same wall thickness and structural characteristics, cellar masters could calculate more precisely how much sugar to add for secondary fermentation. They could predict with reasonable accuracy what percentage of bottles would survive. The catastrophic loss rates that had plagued earlier generations, sometimes 50% or more, dropped to manageable levels, typically under 10% even in challenging vintages. The bottles themselves became lighter as manufacturers learned to engineer strength through shape rather than sheer mass. The modern champagne bottle, with its distinctive punt, sloped shoulders and reinforced rim, evolved during this period. Engineers applied principles of pressure vessel design, knowledge hard-won in the steam engine and boiler industries, to create bottles that directed stress optimally. A well-designed bottle could withstand pressure that would shatter a poorly designed one of the same thickness. Glass colour also became standardised. The dark green glass that champagne bottles are typically made from wasn't merely aesthetic, it protected wine from light damage. Experiments in the mid-19th century demonstrated that white or clear bottles allowed light to penetrate, causing chemical reactions that could create off flavours. Dark glass filtered harmful wavelengths while remaining transparent enough to judge wine clarity during production. The phylloxera catastrophe. Just as champagne's production was scaling to industrial levels, disaster struck. In the 1860s, vineyard owners across Europe began noticing something terrifying. Their vines were dying. Leaves would yellow prematurely. Growth would become stunted, and within a few years, the entire vine would perish. The cause was invisible, mysterious, and seemingly unstoppable. The culprit was Phylloxera vastatrix, a microscopic aphid native to North America. These tiny insects fed on vine roots, injecting saliva that caused galls and secondary infections. Native American grape species had evolved alongside Phylloxera and developed resistance, but European Vitis vinifera vines, the species used for virtually all quality wine production, had no defence. A single infested vine could spread the pest to neighbours through underground root contact, and the aphids could also be transported on boots, tools and equipment. Phylloxera had arrived in Europe accidentally, likely on American vine specimens imported for botanical study. The first confirmed European outbreak occurred in southern France in the 1860s, but the pest spread with horrifying speed. By the 1870s, it had reached Champagne. Vineyard after vineyard succumbed. Ancient vines that had produced wine for generations withered and died. The region's viticultural heritage seemed in imminent danger of extinction. The economic impact was catastrophic. Champagne houses had invested enormous sums in expanding production, building new cellars, purchasing equipment, and establishing distribution networks. Now their supply of grapes was collapsing. Prices for healthy grapes skyrocketed as vineyards died faster than they could be replanted. Some houses faced bankruptcy. Workers who depended on vineyard employment found themselves without livelihood. The wine world mounted a desperate search for solutions. Thousands of proposed remedies were tried. Flooding vineyards, phylloxera couldn't survive underwater. Injecting carbon disulfide into the soil, a toxic chemical that killed the aphids but also damaged vines. Covering vineyards with sand, which the aphids couldn't navigate. Even introducing predators that might eat the pests. Some of these approaches showed limited success, but none provided a comprehensive solution. The answer, when it finally emerged, was both elegant and humbling: grafting. French viticulturists, working with American colleagues, discovered that they could graft European Vitis vinifera grape varieties onto rootstock from American grape species. The American roots were resistant to phylloxera, while the grafted European portion produced the same quality grapes as ungrafted vines. The resulting hybrid was essentially a European vine standing on American feet. The replanting effort was monumental. Virtually every vineyard in Champagne had to be torn out and replanted with grafted vines. The process took decades and required enormous investment. Young vines don't produce viable crops for several years, meaning that the region faced an extended period of reduced production. Moreover, the grafting had to be done skillfully. Poor grafts would fail, and matching the right rootstock to each vineyard's specific soil and climate conditions required careful experimentation. By the 1890s, the crisis had largely passed. Champagne's vineyards were replanted with grafted vines, and production began recovering. But the experience had been traumatic, leaving the industry more conscious of its vulnerability and more invested in scientific research to prevent future catastrophes. The phylloxera crisis also accelerated consolidation. Smaller producers who couldn't afford the replanting investment were bought out by larger houses, further concentrating the industry. The great houses rise. The 19th century saw the establishment and expansion of the great champagne houses that would dominate the industry for generations. While some houses trace their origins to earlier periods, Ruinart to 1729, Moet to 1743, the 1800s witnessed an explosion of new foundations and the growth of existing houses into industrial scale operations. Moet and Chandon became the industry's giant under the leadership of Jean-Remy Moet, who transformed his family's modest wine business into an international powerhouse. Jean-Remy cultivated relationships with European nobility and royalty, most famously with Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor was said to favour Moet's wines, and after his military victories he would often stop at the Moet estate in Epernay to celebrate. This royal association proved invaluable for marketing. What greater endorsement could exist than being Napoleon's preferred champagne? Louis Roederer, founded in 1776 but rising to prominence in the 19th century, pursued a different strategy focused on vertical integration and quality control. The house invested heavily in acquiring vineyards, ensuring control over grape supply and quality. In 1876, Roederer created Crystal, a prestige cuvée made in clear glass bottles specifically for Tsar Alexander II of Russia. The Russian market was crucial for champagne. The Russian nobility's taste for very sweet champagne drove significant sales volumes and premium prices. Madame Pommery, another widow who took control of her late husband's business, revolutionized champagne style in the 1860s and 1870s by popularizing brut champagne, far drier than the heavily sweetened styles that had previously dominated. This innovation responded to evolving tastes, particularly in the French market, where preferences were shifting toward less sweet wines. Pommery's brut style required exceptional base wine quality, since sugar could no longer mask flaws, pushing the entire industry toward higher standards. The Belle Epoque, that glittering period from roughly 1870 to 1914, witnessed champagne's apotheosis as not merely a wine but a symbol. In the gaslit theatres of Paris, the grand hotels of London, the ballrooms of St. Petersburg, and the newly prosperous cities of America, champagne became the liquid embodiment of celebration itself, of sophistication, of arrival. The cork's pop announced not just the opening of a bottle, but the beginning of life's finest moments. This transformation from beverage to symbol was neither accidental nor inevitable. It was carefully cultivated through deliberate marketing, strategic brand building, and the exploitation of champagne's presence at the intersection of art, literature, and social aspiration. The empire of exports. The final decades of the 19th century saw champagne exports explode to unprecedented levels. By 1900, the region was producing over 30 million bottles annually, with more than half destined for foreign markets. Three markets in particular drove this expansion: Imperial Russia, Britain, and the United States, each representing different consumer profiles and requiring distinct marketing approaches. Russia had emerged as champagne's most lucrative market by the 1880s. The Russian aristocracy and wealthy merchant class consumed champagne in staggering quantities, favouring intensely sweet styles that would shock modern palates. Some cuvées destined for Russia contained over 300 grams of sugar per litre, closer to dessert wine than contemporary champagne. The Russian taste for extreme sweetness actually served a practical purpose. It masked flaws in base wines and allowed producers to use less than perfect grapes, though the premium houses still use quality fruit even for their sweet Russian cuvées. Louis Roederer's relationship with the Russian imperial court exemplified the market's importance. Tsar Alexander II became so fond of Roederer's champagne that he requested a special cuvée made exclusively for the imperial family. The result was Cristal, first produced in 1876, presented in clear glass bottles rather than the standard dark green, supposedly because the Tsar feared assassins might hide bombs in the punt of a dark bottle. Whether this story is apocryphal or not, it illustrates the intimate connection between champagne houses and Russian nobility. The Russian market's prosperity proved precarious. Political instability periodically disrupted trade, and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 would eventually eliminate the market entirely, forcing champagne houses to rapidly pivot toward other customers. But during the Belle Epoque, Russian gold financed enormous expansion in Champagne, funding vineyard acquisitions, cellar construction, and technological improvements. Britain represented a more stable, if less extravagant, market. The British upper and middle classes had embraced champagne throughout the 19th century, and by the Belle Epoque, it had become an essential element of refined entertaining. British tastes ran toward drier styles than Russia preferred, though still considerably sweeter than modern champagne. The terms sec, dry, and demi-sec, half-dry on 19th century champagne, would strike modern drinkers as quite sweet. What we now call brut barely existed until Madame Pommery pioneered it in the 1870s, and brut nature or zero dosage wouldn't become available until much later. British importers became powerful intermediaries between champagne producers and consumers, often commissioning special blends and establishing long-term exclusive relationships with particular houses. Some British merchants even established their own champagne brands, buying wine from champagne producers and marketing it under English names. This practice, while creating competition for the French houses, also helped expand overall market awareness and consumption. America represented the future. The rapidly industrializing United States was creating vast fortunes, and the newly wealthy sought European luxury goods to demonstrate their sophistication. Champagne fit perfectly. It was French, and thus culturally prestigious, expensive and thus exclusive, and associated with celebration and success. American robber barons, railroad magnates, and industrial titans served champagne at their lavish parties, and American popular culture quickly absorbed champagne as a symbol of the high life. The American market was also less constrained by tradition than European markets. Americans were willing to try different styles, experiment with serving methods, and incorporate champagne into occasions beyond formal dinners. Champagne cocktails became popular in American bars, mixing champagne with bitters, sugar, and brandy, or later with orange juice to create the mimosa. These innovations sometimes horrified French purists, but expanded champagne's versatility and appeal. The birth of modern marketing. The champagne houses of the Belle Epoque pioneered marketing techniques that seem startlingly modern. They understood, perhaps earlier than any other wine region, that they were selling not just a beverage, but an experience, an aspiration, an identity. The wine in the bottle was important, certainly, but equally important was the story the bottle told. Label design became an art form in itself. Champagne houses commissioned renowned artists and designers to create labels that would stand out in crowded wine merchants' shops and on elegant dining tables. The labels grew increasingly elaborate, embossed gold foil, intricate illustrations, heraldic symbols, florid typography. Each house developed distinctive visual identities that customers could recognize instantly. Moet and Chandon's red ribbon and seal, Veuve Clicquot's signature orange label, Paul Rogers' understated elegance. These visual markers became as important as the wine itself. The houses understood the power of association and celebrity endorsement long before these became standard marketing techniques. When a member of royalty favoured a particular champagne, the house would publicise this connection relentlessly, incorporating royal warrants and coats of arms into their marketing materials. When famous artists, writers, or socialites were known to prefer a particular brand, this information spread through carefully cultivated relationships with journalists and society columnists. Champagne houses sponsored elaborate events, grand dinners, charity balls, racing competitions, where their products would be prominently featured. They maintained relationships with the finest restaurants and hotels, ensuring their champagnes appeared on the most prestigious wine lists. Some houses maintained tasting rooms and hospitality facilities where important customers and opinion leaders could be entertained lavishly, experiencing the romance of champagne terroir firsthand. Advertising emerged as a crucial tool. Champagne advertisements appeared in newspapers, magazines, and even early posters plastered on city walls. These advertisements rarely focused on taste or production methods. Instead, they depicted elegant social scenes, beautiful women, celebrations, and luxury. The message was clear. Champagne belonged to a world of refinement and pleasure that consumers could access by purchasing the bottle. The marketing sometimes involved outright myth-making. Stories about Dom Perignon inventing champagne were embellished and promoted despite historical inaccuracy. Tales of champagne's association with royalty, some true, some exaggerated, some completely fabricated, proliferated. The mythology served a purpose. It gave champagne a narrative grandeur that justified premium pricing and enhanced its luxury positioning. Champagne in culture. The Belle Epoque saw champagne thoroughly integrated into the artistic and literary culture of the age. Impressionist painters depicted champagne-soaked social scenes. Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party captures friends sharing a leisurely afternoon. Champagne bottles prominently featured. Toulouse-Lautrec's posters for Parisian cabarets invariably included champagne as an essential element of the nightlife he depicted. The wine had become visual shorthand for modernity, pleasure, and sophisticated leisure. Literature of the period treated champagne with similar reverence. In Guy de Maupassant's short stories, champagne marks crucial social moments and reveals character through who drinks it and how. Oscar Wilde's plays feature champagne as both prop and punchline, essential to the witty, dissolute world his characters inhabit. F. Scott Fitzgerald, writing slightly later but capturing the same spirit, would make champagne inseparable from jazz-age glamour in The Great Gatsby. The opera and theatre world embraced champagne both on stage and off. Act 2 finales would often feature champagne drinking scenes, providing opportunities for elaborate staging and allowing audiences to fantasize about the luxurious lives depicted. Behind the curtain, champagne flowed in dressing rooms and at after parties, binding performers, patrons, and audiences in shared celebration. The emerging world of haute couture and fashion connected intimately with champagne. Fashion shows and salon openings served champagne as a matter of course. The association was mutually reinforcing. Champagne suggested the elegance and luxury that fashion houses wanted to embody, while fashion's glamorous world provided champagne with valuable cultural cachet. The champagne coupe, the wide, shallow glass that had become fashionable, was itself a design object, elegant and distinctive. Myths and the Marie Antoinette legend. No piece of champagne mythology proved more durable than the legend connecting the champagne coupe to Marie Antoinette's breast. According to the story, the coupe's distinctive shape was modelled on a wax casting of the ill-fated Queen's breast, created at the order of her husband, King Louis XVI, for service at Versailles. The tale combined sex, royalty, luxury, and champagne into an irresistible narrative. The story is almost certainly false. The coupe predates Marie Antoinette, with similar glasses appearing in England as early as the 1660s. Moreover, the coupe is actually a poor vessel for champagne. Its wide, shallow shape allows bubbles and aromatics to dissipate quickly. The flute, which wouldn't become standard until the 20th century, preserves carbonation and concentrates aromas far more effectively. But the myth's falsity didn't diminish its power. Champagne houses allowed, even encouraged, the story's circulation. It added an element of scandalous glamour to their product, suggesting intimate connections between champagne and the most exclusive circles of power and pleasure. The story appeared in advertisements, was repeated in newspaper articles, and was whispered at elegant parties. Whether anyone truly believed it mattered less than the associations it created. Similar myths proliferated. Stories claimed that Dom Perignon had been blind, that he could identify any vineyard by taste alone, that he had uttered the famous "tasting the stars" line, all either completely fabricated or heavily embellished. The historical Dom Perignon was impressive enough, but the mythological version served marketing purposes that mere facts could not. These myths reveal something important about champagne's cultural position in the Belle Époque. The truth that champagne resulted from cold winters, patient refinement, and industrial scaling was less compelling than stories involving genius monks, royal breasts, and mystical insight. Champagne had transcended its actual origins to become a canvas onto which consumers could project fantasies of elegance, pleasure, and escape from mundane reality. Stratification and accessibility. By 1900, the champagne market had developed sophisticated price stratification. At the pinnacle sat prestige cuvées like Louis Roederer's Cristal, expensive, rare, marketed to the ultra-wealthy and those who aspired to their ranks. Below these came the standard offerings from prestigious houses, still expensive but within reach of the prosperous middle class for special occasions. But the market also expanded downward. Smaller producers and cooperatives offered champagne at lower price points, making the wine accessible to a broader range of consumers. These bottles might not carry the prestige of Moet or Roederer, but they were genuine champagne, made using the same basic methods. A middle-class family celebrating a wedding or promotion could afford a bottle, participating in the same ritual of celebration that aristocrats had long enjoyed. Devastation. 4 years of trench warfare had scarred the landscape beyond recognition. Vineyards lay cratered and contaminated, their soils poisoned by chemical weapons and choked with unexploded ordnance. Nearly 30% of the region's productive land had been directly damaged by combat, while years of neglect had allowed disease and weeds to reclaim what shells had spared. The chalky hillsides, once precisely terraced and tended, now resembled a moonscape. Yet even before the vines could be replanted, the old tensions between growers and houses reignited, this time with unprecedented fury. The broken peace. The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, but the Champagne region awakened to the war, had temporarily united Champagne against a common enemy, but victory exposed fractures that ran deeper than any shell crater. Growers returned from the trenches to find their vineyards destroyed and their prospects grim. The Grandes Maisons, meanwhile, had maintained their cellars and infrastructure, weathering the storm with their capital reserves intact. When peacetime production resumed, the power imbalance became impossible to ignore. The immediate challenge was physical reconstruction. Clearing unexploded munitions alone took years, with farmers discovering artillery shells while ploughing well into the 1920s. Replanting required capital most growers simply didn't have. Young vines take 3 to 5 years before they produce usable grapes, and 7 to 10 years before reaching full productivity. For small proprietors already impoverished by the war, this timeline meant starvation or debt. The Champagne houses offered loans and contracts, but the terms reflected their leverage. Grape prices, which growers had hoped would rise given the scarcity, remained stubbornly low. The houses argued they were rebuilding demand in markets disrupted by war, investing in promotion and distribution while growers merely had to plant vines. Growers countered that without grapes, there was no champagne to sell, and that the houses were exploiting their temporary weakness to lock in permanently disadvantageous prices. This wasn't mere haggling. It was an existential battle over who would bear the cost of the region's recovery and who would reap its eventual rewards. The growers saw themselves as having defended French soil with their blood, only to return home and be treated as mere suppliers to wealthy merchants. The houses saw themselves as the guardians of Champagne's reputation, the ones who had built its global prestige through decades of careful marketing and quality control. By the mid-1920s, with production finally recovering, the tension reached a breaking point. 1927, when words became violence. The winter of 1927 was particularly bitter in Champagne, but the cold that gripped the region had little to do with weather. Negotiations over that year's grape harvest had collapsed. The houses, citing weak export markets and excess inventory, offered prices that growers considered insulting, barely enough to cover costs, let alone compensate for years of wartime losses. On January the 10th, frustration exploded into violence. In A, a crowd of growers attacked a Champagne house warehouse, smashing windows and destroying equipment. Within days, the riots had spread throughout the region. In Epernay, thousands of vignerons marched through the streets, setting fires and confronting police. The targets were symbolic, not just champagne houses, but also the homes of wealthy merchants, the shipping facilities that sent bottles to foreign markets, the physical infrastructure of an industry that growers felt had betrayed them. The violence was not spontaneous. It was organised, coordinated, and frighteningly effective. Growers established roadblocks to prevent grape shipments. They threatened brokers who tried to negotiate independent deals. In some villages, they physically prevented harvest crews employed by the houses from entering vineyards. This was economic warfare waged with rocks, clubs, and burning barrels. The houses responded by importing grapes from outside the traditional Champagne region, a move that enraged growers even further as it threatened to dilute the very identity of Champagne. If Champagne could be made from any grapes, what value remained in owning land in this specific place? The geographic specificity that made Champagne valuable was suddenly its vulnerability. Government mediators rushed to Champagne, terrified that the unrest might spread or harden into permanent class warfare. What they found was not simply a labour dispute, but a profound crisis of definition. Who owned Champagne? The people who grew the grapes, or the people who made the wine? The workers whose families had tended these slopes for generations, or the entrepreneurs who had built the global brand? The riots eventually subsided, suppressed by police action and exhaustion rather than resolution. But they had exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Champagne's success had created a system so unequal that it threatened to destroy itself. The region needed rules, boundaries, definitions, not just for economic fairness, but for its very survival. Defining Champagne. The solution came slowly, built on foundations laid before the war, but only completed in its aftermath. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Champagne would be defined not by who made it, but by where the grapes came from. Geography, not ownership, would be the governing principle. The Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée system, established by French law in 1936, formalised what the 1919 boundaries had begun. The AOC rules specified precisely which communes could grow grapes for Champagne, what varieties were permitted, how vines must be cultivated, what yields were acceptable, and what methods must be used in production. These weren't mere guidelines. They were legal requirements, enforceable in court. The genius of the AOC was that it protected everyone by protecting the name itself. Growers gained guaranteed value for their land and labour. Only grapes from AOC vineyards could be called Champagne grapes, creating a permanent scarcity premium. Houses gained quality assurance and brand protection. The AOC standards maintained Champagne's reputation for excellence. Consumers gained authenticity. The label Champagne now carried legal meaning, a verifiable guarantee of origin and method. But the AOC also created new battles, fought in courtrooms rather than streets. The most immediate concerned imitation. Across France, producers of sparkling wine in other regions had been using the name Champagne or variations thereof. The AOC ended that practice domestically, but international markets were another matter entirely. In the United States, the Treaty of Versailles had included champagne protections, but American wine producers argued, sometimes successfully, that champagne was a generic term for sparkling wine, not a protected origin designation. The argument had some historical basis. Before the 1891 Madrid Agreement, champagne had indeed been used loosely around the world. American producers claimed they had built businesses in good faith using a term they believed was descriptive, not proprietary. By the 1920s, California champagne was an established product category. Forcing producers to abandon the name, they argued, would destroy their investments and confuse consumers who understood champagne to mean a type of wine, not necessarily wine from Champagne. The French response was uncompromising. Champagne was not a type but a place. Using the name for wine made elsewhere was fraud, pure and simple, like calling something Florida oranges when the oranges came from California. The method champenoise might be replicated anywhere, but champagne could only come from Champagne. This battle would continue for decades, fought trade agreement by trade agreement, market by market. But the legal framework, established in 1936, provided the weapon. Champagne now had an enforceable definition, backed by French law and increasingly by international treaties. The region had transformed its identity into a legal asset. Prohibition and its paradoxes. While France was defining champagne through law, the United States had outlawed alcohol entirely. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, should have destroyed the American champagne market. Instead, it created one of the strangest chapters in the drink's history. Legal champagne exports to the United States dropped to virtually zero between 1920 and 1933. But champagne still flowed into America, through Canada, through the Caribbean, through diplomatic pouches and smuggling networks. Ironically, prohibition may have enhanced champagne's mystique. Scarcity drove up prices and illegality added glamour. The speakeasy culture of the 1920s fetishized champagne as the ultimate symbol of sophisticated rebellion. The champagne houses found themselves in an awkward position. Officially, they deplored prohibition and suspended American sales. Unofficially, they knew their product was reaching American consumers and commanding premium prices. Some turned a blind eye to distributors whose shipments to Canada or Cuba mysteriously equaled American pre-prohibition consumption. Others maintained strict propriety, sacrificing profits for principle. When Prohibition ended in 1933, American demand for champagne returned with force, but the market had changed. 14 years of illegality had destroyed established distribution networks and created new ones. American consumers had developed tastes for whiskey and cocktails. Most significantly, American sparkling wine producers had continued operating, making champagne for industrial and medicinal purposes, and emerging from prohibition positioned to compete in ways they hadn't before. The stage was set for the label battles that would define the late 20th century. Depression and luxury. The Great Depression struck just as champagne was recovering from war and defining its legal identity. Luxury goods suffer disproportionately in economic downturns, and champagne, the ultimate luxury, nearly collapsed. Sales plummeted after 1929. The houses cut production, laid off workers, let harvests rot on the vine. Some of the most prestigious names faced bankruptcy. Growers who had finally achieved some security through the AOC system watched prices crater again. The legal protections couldn't create demand where none existed. Yet the Depression also revealed champagne's resilience. The drink had become so associated with celebration, so embedded in cultural rituals, that it never disappeared entirely. Weddings still happened, albeit smaller. Holidays still came. And champagne, however expensive, remained the required symbol for moments that demanded marking. The houses survived by contracting severely but maintaining quality. They refused to cheapen the product or compromise standards, calculating correctly that champagne's value lay precisely in its exclusivity and excellence. When prosperity eventually returned, the brand would be intact. This strategy required sacrifice. Employment dropped, villages emptied as workers sought jobs elsewhere, family vineyards went fallow. But the infrastructure survived. The chalk cellars, the knowledge, the reputation. By 1936, when the AOC formalised champagne's legal protection, the region was defending an idea as much as an industry: the legal weapon. The interwar period transformed champagne from a geographic expression into a legal construct. The AOC system didn't just protect champagne, it provided a model for protecting all geographic products. The battles over Champagne's name established precedents that would be applied to Roquefort, Cognac, Bordeaux, to European agriculture generally. This was cultural warfare by contract and statute. The French argued that geographic indications represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, tradition, and reputation. They were intellectual property as legitimate as patents or trademarks, perhaps more so because they belonged to communities rather than corporations. Protecting these names wasn't protectionism, it was preventing fraud and preserving heritage. The German army reached Epernay on June 12, 1940. For the second time in a generation, Champagne found itself under occupation. But this time would be different. The Great War had been fought over the region. The Second World War would be fought within it. A conflict not of trenches, but of champagne cellars, ledgers, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose to resist in the only ways available to them. The Wehrmacht arrived with shopping lists. The Weinführer Otto Kleibisch made his headquarters in a requisitioned mansion in Epernay, surrounded by maps showing every significant champagne house and vineyard in the region. His title was Weinführer, wine leader, and his mission was simple: extract maximum value from champagne for the German war effort while maintaining production capacity for future use. Kleibisch was no brute. He was a wine merchant himself, a man who understood champagne's production complexities and appreciated its cultural significance. This made him more dangerous than a mere plunderer. He knew exactly what he was taking and how much it was worth. The demands began immediately. German officers requisitioned millions of bottles for the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the SS. These weren't random seizures. They were calculated appropriations of the finest vintages from the best houses. Payment was offered in Reichsmarks at exchange rates that amounted to confiscation. Refusal was not an option. German soldiers were stationed at every major house, monitoring production and inventories. But Kleibisch also understood that killing the golden goose served no purpose. He needed champagne production to continue, which meant maintaining the cooperation, however coerced, of the houses and growers. His approach was insidiously clever: extract enormous quantities immediately, then establish normal commercial relations that would sustain production throughout the occupation. The champagne houses faced an impossible choice: cooperate and supply the enemy, or resist and face destruction. Most chose a third path: the appearance of cooperation concealing layers of deception. The art of hidden resistance. Robert Jean de Vogüé, director of Moet and Chandon, became the unlikely leader of Champagne's quiet resistance. An aristocrat who could have collaborated comfortably, he instead chose to obstruct the Germans through bureaucratic sabotage and hidden defiance. The tactics were subtle but effective. When German officers demanded specific vintages, de Vogüé's staff would discover that those bottles had been damaged, destroyed in pre-war accidents, or simply miscounted in inventory. Paperwork became mysteriously confused. Delivery schedules experienced inexplicable delays. The finest bottles were reported as lost, while lesser wines were substituted in their place. Most audaciously, the houses began hiding their best reserves. The chalk cellars of Champagne descend multiple levels underground, creating vast labyrinths that even the occupiers couldn't fully map or monitor. False walls appeared overnight. Tunnels were bricked shut, their entrances plastered over and aged to match surrounding walls. Inventory books recorded bottles that had been moved to hidden chambers, their existence officially denied. The Germans suspected deception but couldn't prove it. Kleybisch knew the houses were holding back, but raiding every cellar in the region would have destroyed the very cooperation he needed to maintain production. The resistance operated in the grey zone between obvious rebellion and plausible deniability. Individual workers engaged in small acts of sabotage. A riddler might deliberately crack bottles during the turning process. A cellar master might let a batch overage or develop off flavours. Labels were occasionally misapplied, sending mediocre bottles in boxes marked for premium cuvées. Each act was small enough to be dismissed as accident or incompetence, but collectively they reduced both the quantity and quality of champagne flowing to Germany. Growers, too, found ways to resist. They would report lower yields than they actually harvested, selling the surplus on black markets rather than to the houses where it might be requisitioned. Some deliberately damaged their own vineyards, claiming disease or poor weather, anything to reduce the supply available to the occupiers. The risk was enormous. The Gestapo operated throughout the region, investigating sabotage and punishing resistance. Workers disappeared into prisons or concentration camps. De Vogüé himself was arrested in 1943, accused of aiding the resistance and hiding champagne reserves. He spent nearly 2 years in German camps, surviving conditions that killed many of his fellow prisoners. Yet the resistance continued. The chalk cellars that had once sheltered refugees now hid more than wine. They concealed weapons, sheltered Allied airmen, served as meeting places for resistance networks. The geography that made Champagne valuable made it equally valuable for clandestine operations. The same underground passages that preserved wine at constant temperatures also provided invisible pathways through occupied territory. The economics of occupation. The German extraction of champagne was staggering in scale. Between 1940 and 1944, the Wehrmacht and various German agencies requisitioned approximately 50 million bottles, nearly a quarter of the region's entire reserves. At pre-war prices, this represented hundreds of millions of francs in value. At the artificially suppressed occupation rates, it was outright theft. Yet production continued, and in some ways even increased. The Germans needed champagne not just for their own consumption, but for diplomatic purposes. Nazi leadership used champagne to impress neutral countries, reward allies, celebrate victories. Hitler himself despised alcohol, but Goering, Ribbentrop, and other Nazi leaders developed expensive tastes for the finest French wines. This created a perverse economic situation. Champagne houses were nominally operating businesses, paying workers, purchasing grapes, maintaining equipment, but their primary customer was their occupier, and payment was at gunpoint. The houses had to keep producing or face closure, but every bottle produced enriched the enemy. Some houses navigated this morally ambiguous territory better than others. A few owners collaborated openly, seeking profit and German favour. Most operated in the grey zone, doing the minimum necessary to survive while engaging in what resistance they could manage. A handful refused entirely and suffered accordingly. Their businesses seized, their families arrested, their property confiscated. The growers faced similar calculations. Selling grapes to the houses meant those grapes would likely become German champagne. But refusing to sell meant no income, and possibly worse consequences. Many compromised, selling some grapes through official channels while hiding portions of their harvest for black market sale or personal consumption. The black market became crucial to survival. Champagne sold for astronomical prices in Paris and other French cities. providing growers and workers with income that didn't flow through German-controlled channels. Some of this champagne reached Allied soldiers and resistance fighters, a small reversal of the occupation's economic extraction. Liberation's complications: when American forces reached Champagne in August 1944, they were greeted as heroes. Bottles that had been hidden for 4 years suddenly appeared, shared in celebration with the liberators. The Germans had been driven out, the houses were free, production could resume normally. But liberation brought its own complications. The Americans proved nearly as thirsty as the Germans had been, though at least they paid in currency worth something. Allied forces requisitioned champagne for victory celebrations, diplomatic functions, officers' clubs. The distinction between requisition and purchase was sometimes academic. More troubling were the accusations. Who had collaborated? Who had profited from the occupation? Who had done only what was necessary to survive, and who had gone beyond necessity into willing partnership with the enemy? These questions had no easy answers. Some cases were clear. A handful of owners who had openly courted German favour faced prosecution for collaboration. Their businesses were seized, their assets frozen. But most situations fell into moral grey areas that defied simple judgment. Had someone who supplied champagne to Germans while secretly hiding reserves collaborated or resisted? What about growers who sold to collaborating houses but gave information to the resistance? The region struggled with these questions, even as it struggled to rebuild. Vineyards had been damaged, not as extensively as in World War I, but significantly nonetheless. The final German retreat had been chaotic, with some units destroying infrastructure out of spite. More critically, 4 years of minimal maintenance had taken a toll. Vines needed extensive work. Cellars required repairs. Equipment was worn out or obsolete. The economic challenge was enormous. France was impoverished. Most export markets were disrupted, and domestic demand was depressed. Yet Champagne had to rebuild immediately or risk losing market position permanently. The houses that survived the occupation did so by resuming production as quickly as possible, even at a loss, to maintain their presence in the market. Memory and mythology. Almost immediately, the occupation's story began to be transformed into legend. The narrative that emerged emphasized resistance while minimizing the complexities of survival under occupation. Every hidden bottle became an act of heroism. Every delayed shipment a victory against the Nazis. This mythology wasn't entirely false. Genuine resistance had occurred. Real risks had been taken. Meaningful quantities of champagne had been saved. But the story simplified the moral ambiguities that had defined the occupation. It overlooked the reality that most people, most of the time, had simply tried to survive, making small compromises that seemed necessary at the time. The figure of Robert Jean de Vogüé became emblematic of this selective memory. His arrest and imprisonment were undeniably heroic, and his survival was remarkable. But he had also directed Moet and Chandon during 4 years of supplying Germans with millions of bottles of champagne. Both facts were true, and both had to be held in tension to understand the occupation accurately. Growers who had sold their harvests to houses that supplied Germans found themselves caught in this narrative tension. Had they collaborated by enabling production, or simply fulfilled their economic obligations? The answer depended partly on what else they had done, whether they had engaged in other forms of resistance, how they had treated their workers, what risks they had taken beyond merely keeping their businesses operating. The champagne that flowed at victory celebrations in 1945 came from bottles hidden in chalk cellars during the darkest years of occupation. It was a fitting symbol. Champagne's future would be built not just on survival, but on what had been preserved through catastrophe. Yet as the celebrations faded and the work of reconstruction began, the region faced a fundamental question. What kind of industry would rise from the rubble? The answer would reshape not just Champagne, but the entire global luxury goods market. Reconstruction as reinvention. The physical rebuilding proceeded with surprising speed. Unlike the devastation of World War I, most vineyards had survived World War II relatively intact. The damage was primarily neglect, vines that needed pruning, soils depleted by years of minimal intervention, equipment worn beyond normal use. By 1946, production had resumed at meaningful levels. By 1950, output exceeded pre-war volumes. But reconstruction meant more than restoring what had been lost. The war years had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in how Champagne was organised, produced and sold. The hidden reserves had demonstrated the importance of strategic planning and cooperation. The occupation had exposed vulnerabilities in a system where individual houses operated independently with minimal coordination. Liberation created an opportunity to build something more resilient. The Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin de Champagne, CIVC or Comité Champagne, had been established in 1941 under Vichy, making its origins politically problematic. Yet its structure proved invaluable. The CIVC brought together grape growers and champagne houses in a single organisation with authority to regulate prices, manage yields, coordinate marketing and enforce quality standards. After liberation, rather than dissolving this creation of the occupation, the French government reinforced it. The decision was controversial, but pragmatic. The old model, houses and growers in constant conflict, individual producers operating independently, no central coordination, had repeatedly failed. The riots of 1927 had demonstrated the cost of unmanaged tension. The war had shown the value of collective action. The CIVC, stripped of its Vichy associations and democratised in its governance, offered a path forward. By the early 1950s, the CIVC had become the most powerful regulatory body in French wine. It set grape prices through negotiated agreements between growers and houses, establishing a formula that balanced both parties' interests. It enforced AOC regulations with real teeth, inspecting vineyards and production facilities, testing wines and maintaining the Échelle des Crus, the ranking system that determined which villages' grapes commanded premium prices. Most importantly, it coordinated marketing and promotion, presenting Champagne to the world as a unified brand rather than competing houses. This was unprecedented. Bordeaux Chateau competed fiercely. Burgundy domains jealously guarded their individual reputations. But Champagne would be different. The CIVC model meant that when one house promoted Champagne, all houses benefited. The rising tide would lift all boats, provided everyone followed the rules. Expansion and its limits. Post-war demand quickly exceeded supply. The American market, shut down during Prohibition and disrupted by war, roared back to life. Britain's appetite for champagne survived rationing and austerity. Even Germany, impoverished and divided, wanted French champagne as a symbol of peacetime prosperity. The houses could have sold far more than they could produce. The obvious solution was expansion. Plant more vineyards, make more champagne. But expansion threatened the scarcity that gave champagne its value. If anyone could grow champagne grapes anywhere, the premium attached to AOC designation would evaporate. The question wasn't whether to expand, but how much, where, and under what controls. The 1927 riots had been fought partly over vineyard boundaries, which villages could grow champagne grapes and which could not. The AOC system had established initial boundaries, but these had been drawn hastily, compromised by political pressure, and left substantial areas in ambiguous status. Post-war prosperity created pressure to revisit these decisions. The CIVC approached expansion methodically. Geological surveys mapped soil composition throughout the region. Historical records documented which areas had produced champagne grapes before phylloxera. Microclimates were studied, slopes analysed, drainage patterns assessed. The goal was to expand only into areas that could genuinely produce champagne quality grapes, maintaining standards while increasing volume. Between 1945 and 1970, the AOC vineyard area expanded by nearly 40%, adding thousands of hectares while maintaining strict quality criteria. Villages that had been excluded in 1927 were reconsidered and sometimes admitted. Areas that had grown champagne grapes historically, but had converted to other crops, were brought back into production. The expansion was substantial but controlled, increasing supply without flooding the market. Yet expansion created new tensions. Villages newly admitted to the AOC system found their land values skyrocketing overnight, a mixed blessing that brought wealth but also property taxes, inheritance complications, and pressure to sell to larger interests. Growers in historically premier villages resented the dilution of their exclusive status. The Échelle des Crus was recalibrated repeatedly, attempting to maintain hierarchies. Even as the system expanded, the fundamental tension remained. Champagne's value depended on scarcity, but profitability required volume. The CIVC managed this through quotas and harvest limitations, restricting yields even from expanded areas. Better to leave grapes unpicked than risk overproduction that might crash prices or require quality compromises. This required discipline from both growers and houses, subordinating short-term profits to long-term brand preservation. Conquering the world. The real revolution was export development. Before the war, champagne had been known primarily in Europe and America. After the war, the CIVC launched a systematic campaign to make champagne global. The American market was crucial. United States consumers in the 1950s had money to spend and an appetite for European sophistication. Champagne fit perfectly into post-war American culture, modern, cosmopolitan, glamorous. Hollywood's obsession with champagne, visible in countless films of the era, provided free advertising worth millions. The CIVC capitalized on this by sponsoring events, cultivating relationships with distributors, and emphasizing champagne's exclusivity. But the American market also posed the old problem. American sparkling wine producers still used the term champagne on their labels, despite French protests. The legal battles that had begun in the 1920s intensified in the 1950s. France argued in trade negotiations that geographic indications should be protected. American negotiators countered that consumers understood champagne as a generic term and that changing labels would confuse the market. The CIVC pursued a two-track strategy. Legally, it supported French government efforts to secure geographic indication protections in trade agreements. Simultaneously, it worked to make champagne synonymous with French champagne through aggressive marketing. If American consumers learnt to associate champagne specifically with France, the generic use of the term would diminish naturally. The strategy worked partially. Premium American producers began voluntarily dropping champagne from their labels, marketing instead as sparkling wine and emphasizing their own regional identities. But cheaper producers continued using the term, and American law continued permitting it. The battle would continue for decades. Britain remained Champagne's most loyal market, with consumption levels that seemed impervious to economic conditions. The British upper classes had champagne habits established over generations, and post-war prosperity extended champagne drinking down the social ladder. The CIVC cultivated this market carefully, supporting traditional retailers while expanding into new channels. Germany presented a more complicated case. Selling French champagne in Germany so soon after the war required delicate handling. Yet German consumers wanted champagne precisely because it was French, a symbol of reconciliation and European unity. By the 1960s, Germany had become one of champagne's largest markets, consuming French wine in quantities that would have seemed impossible 15 years earlier. Emerging markets in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere received exploratory attention. The CIVC understood that champagne's future lay in global expansion, but it proceeded cautiously, preferring to establish strong positions in a few markets, rather than dilute its efforts across many. Cold War bubbles champagne became an unlikely Cold War weapon. When Soviet leaders wanted to signal openness to the West, they drank champagne at diplomatic receptions. When Western governments hosted Eastern Bloc officials, champagne appeared as a gesture of hospitality and hope for détente. The drink that Napoleon had loved became a currency of Cold War diplomacy. This had practical effects on production. The CIVC maintained reserves specifically for diplomatic purposes, ensuring that French embassies worldwide never ran short. Champagne appeared at every significant negotiation, summit, and state dinner. It became shorthand for important occasion, its presence signalling that what was happening mattered. The symbolism worked in both directions. Soviet production of Soviet champagne, Sovetskoye Shampanskoye, represented an attempt to democratize luxury, making sparkling wine available to workers rather than just elites. The French viewed this as both flattery and threat. Flattery because imitation validated champagne's status, threat because cheap copies might undermine the market for the real thing. The CIVC responded by doubling down on authenticity. Marketing emphasized not just quality, but terroir, tradition, and artisanal production methods. Real champagne came from specific soil, specific grapes, specific techniques. Soviet factories could produce bubbles, but they couldn't reproduce champagne. The beginnings of empire. The post-war period saw the first stirrings of what would become LVMH, Moet Hennessy, Louis Vuitton, though that name and structure lay years in the future. What began in the 1960s was simpler, champagne houses merging with each other and with cognac producers, seeking scale and diversification. Moet and Chandon led the consolidation, having survived the war with its reputation enhanced and its leadership, including the returned Robert Jean de Viguier, intact. Moet was positioned to expand aggressively. It acquired other houses, invested in vineyard expansion, and pioneered modern marketing techniques. Most significantly, it began thinking of champagne not as a family business, but as a global brand. This represented a philosophical shift. Traditional champagne houses had been family enterprises, passed down through generations, operated with more concern for reputation than profit maximization. The new model treated champagne as a business first, not carelessly or without quality concerns, but with professional management, strategic planning, and growth targets. Other houses followed similar paths. Acquisitions and mergers accelerated. Capital requirements for expansion and marketing favoured larger entities. By 1970, the industry was consolidating into tiers. A few large houses with global distribution, mid-sized houses serving regional markets, and small producers focusing on premium niches. This consolidation alarmed some observers. Would champagne become just another mass market product, its artisanal character sacrificed to efficiency? Would the Grandes Maisons absorb all competition, eliminating diversity? The CIVC attempted to balance consolidation with preservation, maintaining standards that protected small producers while allowing economies of scale for larger ones. Premium pricing as strategy. Perhaps the most consequential decision of the post-war period was Champagne's commitment to premium pricing. Despite pressure to expand volume and despite the temptation to compete on price, the industry collectively decided that champagne would remain expensive. In 1978, a bottle of Dom Perignon appeared in a scene from Superman. In 1985, Crystal became synonymous with hip-hop luxury when rappers began name-dropping it in lyrics. In 1992, Japanese consumers were buying champagne at rates that exceeded per capita consumption in France itself. These weren't random cultural moments, they were symptoms of champagne's transformation from European luxury to global status symbol, a shift that would define the industry for decades and create both unprecedented prosperity and unforeseen vulnerabilities. The status symbol economy, champagne, had always signified celebration and luxury, but the globalization era elevated it to something more, a universal language of success. In Tokyo boardrooms and Manhattan penthouses, Moscow nightclubs and Sao Paulo galas, champagne served the same function, visible proof that you had arrived. This shift was partly intentional. The Grandes Maisons invested heavily in marketing that positioned champagne not as a beverage but as an experience, a lifestyle, an aspiration. Advertising featured wealth, beauty, sophistication and glamour, rarely mentioning taste or production methods. The message was clear. Champagne wasn't about what you drank, but about who you were when you drank it. But the transformation also emerged organically from globalization itself. As wealth spread beyond traditional European and American elites, newly affluent consumers worldwide sought symbols that signaled their status internationally. Champagne, with its French pedigree and established reputation, provided instant recognition. A bottle of Moet transcended language barriers. Everyone understood what it meant. The Grandes Maisons seized this opportunity ruthlessly. They opened offices in Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, Mumbai, anywhere wealth was accumulating. They sponsored Formula One races, fashion shows, film festivals, art exhibitions. They cultivated relationships with celebrities, ensuring that champagne appeared at every high-profile event. When cameras captured someone wealthy or famous, champagne was inevitably nearby. This strategy succeeded spectacularly. Global sales exploded, with growth in emerging markets far exceeding that in traditional ones. By the 1990s, champagne shipments had more than doubled from 1970 levels, with the majority going to markets that barely existed a generation earlier. Yet success came with complications. As champagne became a mass luxury, an oxymoron that captured the era's contradictions, the tension between exclusivity and accessibility intensified. Houses wanted to sell more while maintaining the perception of scarcity. They needed champagne to seem special while making it widely available. This required increasingly sophisticated marketing and ever finer market segmentation. Japan's love affair. No market illustrated champagne's globalization more dramatically than Japan. Japanese consumers embraced champagne with an enthusiasm that astonished even the most optimistic marketers. By the early 1990s, Japan had become champagne's second largest export market, purchasing quantities that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. The Japanese market was different from traditional champagne consumers. Many Japanese buyers had no historical connection to French wine culture, no family traditions of champagne at celebrations. Instead, they adopted champagne as a symbol of modernity, international sophistication, and economic success. The bubble economy of the 1980s, named ironically for speculative excess rather than sparkling wine, created enormous wealth seeking visible expression. Champagne fit perfectly. It was expensive, foreign, associated with European elegance, and came in beautiful bottles that displayed well. Japanese department stores created elaborate champagne sections, presenting bottles as luxury goods comparable to designer handbags or watches. Hostess clubs and nightclubs went through cases nightly, with champagne service becoming a ritual of conspicuous consumption. The Grandes Maison responded by tailoring products specifically for Japanese tastes. They discovered that Japanese consumers preferred sweeter dosage levels and lighter styles. They created special cuvées for the Japanese market, packaged bottles in gift sets with elaborate presentations, and launched extensive advertising campaigns featuring Japanese celebrities. More significantly, the Japanese market taught the champagne industry about the power of brand hierarchy. Japanese consumers were extraordinarily brand conscious, willing to pay substantial premiums for prestigious names. This validated Champagne's strategy of maintaining high prices and investing in brand building rather than competing on value. If you could create the perception of superiority, consumers would pay almost any price. When Japan's bubble economy collapsed in the early 1990s, champagne sales there crashed as well. But the lesson remained. There were markets worldwide willing to embrace champagne, not for its taste or tradition, but for what it represented. The challenge was finding them before their bubbles burst. The grower revolution, while Grandes Maisons dominated global markets, a quiet revolution was occurring in champagne itself. Grower producers, vignerons who made champagne from their own grapes rather than selling to houses, began gaining recognition and respect from consumers and critics. This wasn't entirely new. Grower champagnes had existed for decades, typically sold locally or to devoted customers who made pilgrimages to Champagne. What changed in the 1970s and 1980s was that these champagnes began receiving serious attention from wine writers and sophisticated consumers who valued authenticity and distinctiveness over brand prestige. The appeal was partly ideological. In an era when corporate consolidation was swallowing traditional producers worldwide, grower champagnes represented resistance, family operations maintaining control over their land and product. They were the antithesis of LVMH's luxury conglomerate model, offering wines that express specific terroir rather than consistent house style. But the appeal was also gustatory. Grower champagnes were often more distinctive, less standardized, more expressive of individual vineyard character. They tended to use grapes from single villages or even single vineyards, whereas house champagnes blended grapes from throughout the region to achieve consistency. For consumers tired of predictable flavors, grower champagnes offered discovery and variety. The rise of grower champagnes created tension within the CIVC. The Grandes Maison had invested enormously in building Champagne's global brand, and they benefited from the halo effect when any champagne succeeded. But they also worried that grower champagnes, with smaller production volumes and less quality control oversight, might damage champagne's reputation if problems arose. Additionally, grower success challenged the narrative that only large houses with extensive reserves and blending expertise could make truly great champagne. The CIVC navigated this by establishing clear labelling requirements that distinguished grower champagnes, RM Récoltant Manipulant from House Champagnes NM Négociant Manipulant. This allowed consumers to make informed choices while maintaining standards for both categories. The effect was to create a more diverse market with room for different models and price points. By 2000, grower champagnes represented a small but growing percentage of total production, and their influence exceeded their volume. They demonstrated that champagne could be more than standardized luxury. It could be artisanal, diverse, and terroir-driven. This pluralism strengthened champagne overall by appealing to different consumer segments and preventing the brand from becoming monolithic. Prestige pyramids. The most significant market evolution was the development of prestige cuvées as a distinct category. Dom Perignon had been introduced in 1936, but it was in the 1970s and 1980s that prestige champagnes became essential to house strategies. The logic was elegant. As champagne became more accessible globally, houses needed products that maintained exclusivity at the very top. Prestige cuvées, super premium champagnes with luxury packaging, extended aging, and prices multiples of standard bottlings served this function. They provided aspiration even for wealthy consumers, something special reserved for the most important occasions or successful individuals. Dom Perignon, Cristal, Krug, Salon, Comte de Champagne. These names became familiar even to people who had never tasted them. They appeared in rap lyrics, James Bond films, and celebrity Instagram posts. They were the champagnes that billionaires bought, that rappers sprayed in nightclubs, that appeared at royal weddings. The prestige category created a new pyramid structure. At the base were non-vintage house champagnes, affordable and widely available. In the middle were vintage champagnes from good years, more expensive and expressive. At the apex were prestige cuvées, priced at levels that seemed disconnected from production costs and justified purely by brand value and scarcity. This structure solved multiple problems simultaneously. It allowed houses to serve different market segments with the same brand. It maintained exclusivity at the top while pursuing volume at the bottom. It created aspiration that drove purchases even of entry-level products. People bought regular Moet hoping someday to afford Dom Perignon. Critically, prestige cuvées generated disproportionate profit margins. While they represented small volumes, their high prices and brand-building value made them extraordinarily valuable. They also shifted competition from price to prestige, allowing houses to avoid destructive price wars by competing instead on luxury positioning. The strategy required maintaining clear distinctions between tiers. If prestige cuvées weren't demonstrably superior to standard bottlings, consumers would resist paying premiums. Houses invested in making their prestige offerings genuinely special. Longer aging, stricter grape selection, more careful production, while also investing in marketing that emphasized their exceptional nature. Vintage market dynamics. The relationship between vintage and non-vintage champagnes evolved dramatically during this period. Traditionally, non-vintage champagne had been considered the standard product, with vintage champagnes produced only in exceptional years. By 2000, this had nearly reversed, with some houses producing vintage champagnes annually and marketing them as superior to non-vintage. This shift reflected changing consumer preferences. As champagne became global, many consumers had no historical understanding of the vintage-non-vintage distinction. They simply assumed that vintage meant better and were willing to pay accordingly. Houses accommodated this by declaring more years as vintage worthy and producing larger quantities of vintage champagne. Critics worried this diluted the meaning of vintage, transforming it from a designation of exceptional years to merely a premium tier. The CIVC maintained that vintage champagnes still met specific quality standards and weren't produced in genuinely poor years, but the frequency of vintage declarations, sometimes 3 or 4 years in a row, suggested that market demands were influencing decisions as much as viticultural conditions. The vintage market also segmented further. Beyond basic vintage champagnes, houses introduced single vineyard bottlings, special cuvées from specific years, and archive releases of older vintages. Each segmentation created new price points and marketing opportunities, transforming what had been a relatively simple product line into a complex portfolio. This complexity served the industry well during the globalization era. Different markets had different preferences. Some valued vintage over non-vintage. Others preferred prestige cuvées. Still others sought grower champagnes or specific styles. By offering diversity, the champagne industry could serve multiple consumer segments while maintaining overall brand coherence. The name wars continue. Throughout the period, legal battles over the champagne name intensified globally. The European Union had established geographic indication protections that prevented non-French producers from using champagne, but much of the world remained contested territory. The United States continued to be the primary battleground. American producers who had used champagne for decades argued they had grandfathered rights. French producers countered that these rights were illegitimate, and that American usage confused consumers and damaged champagne's reputation. Trade negotiations became flashpoints, with champagne protections often caught up in broader disputes over agriculture, intellectual property, and market access. The CIVC pursued a sophisticated legal strategy. Rather than fighting every instance of misuse, it focused on establishing precedents in key markets and supporting local producers who voluntarily adopted alternative terminology. On a September morning in 2003, harvest crews entered the vineyards of Champagne on August 18th, the earliest start date ever recorded. The previous record, set in 1822, had stood for 181 years. Viticulturalists who had spent careers timing harvests by historical patterns found themselves rewriting centuries of accumulated knowledge. Climate change, long whispered about in technical circles, had announced itself unmistakably. The 21st century would demand adaptation on a scale that made previous challenges seem manageable by comparison. Yet even as the earth warmed, Champagne was experiencing a renaissance of innovation, diversification and cultural influence that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The digital luxury paradox. Luxury brands had traditionally relied on scarcity, exclusivity, and carefully controlled distribution. The internet threatened all of this. Digital commerce made products accessible to anyone with a credit card. Social media democratized brand conversations, taking control away from marketers and giving it to consumers. Information that brands had carefully curated became instantly available to anyone with a search engine. Champagne houses faced a fundamental dilemma: embrace digital channels and risk cheapening the brand, or resist and risk irrelevance. The Grandes Maisons approached this cautiously. Initial websites were essentially digital brochures, beautiful but static, informative but not transactional. Direct online sales were avoided, preserving traditional distribution relationships and maintaining price controls. Social media presence was established but carefully managed, with content emphasizing heritage, craftsmanship, and luxury rather than accessibility. But younger, smaller producers embraced digital tools more aggressively. Grower champagnes, which had struggled to reach consumers beyond their immediate regions, suddenly had global reach. A vigneron in a tiny village could build an international following through Instagram, sharing images of vineyards, harvest, and winemaking. Direct-to-consumer shipping, where legally permitted, allowed small producers to bypass traditional distribution entirely. This created a bifurcation in champagne marketing. The Grandes Maison maintained traditional luxury positioning while adapting selectively to digital channels. Smaller producers used digital tools to democratize access and build direct relationships with consumers. Both approaches succeeded, but they served different markets and communicated different values. The most sophisticated houses learned to use digital channels to enhance rather than undermine luxury. Dom Perignon created exclusive online experiences available only to registered members. Krug developed apps that provided detailed information about specific bottles, creating engagement without compromising prestige. The strategy was to use technology to deepen relationships with existing luxury consumers rather than to reach mass markets. By 2015, Champagne had largely solved the digital luxury paradox. Online presence enhanced brand value when managed properly. Digital channels provided information and engagement without replacing the experience of purchasing and consuming champagne. The key was maintaining control over how the brand was represented while acknowledging that consumers expected digital access. Warming world, changing wine. The 2003 heat wave that brought the earliest harvest on record was a harbinger. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, temperature patterns in Champagne shifted measurably. Average growing season temperatures increased by approximately 1.0 since the 1950s. Harvest dates advanced by nearly 2 weeks. Extreme weather events, severe storms, unseasonal frosts, hailstorms became more frequent and unpredictable. The effects on wine quality were complex. Warmer temperatures produced riper grapes with higher potential alcohol and more developed flavours. Vintages like 2003, 2009 and 2015 demonstrated that warmth could create champagnes of exceptional richness and intensity. The traditional concern that grapes in Champagne wouldn't ripen adequately became irrelevant in many years. But warmth also brought challenges. Higher ripeness meant lower acidity, threatening Champagne's characteristic freshness and aging potential. Earlier harvests meant grapes developed differently, with aromatic profiles that didn't match historical norms. The careful balance between sugar and acid that defined Champagne became harder to achieve naturally. More troubling were the secondary effects. Warmer winters meant less winter hardiness for vines, increasing vulnerability to spring frosts. Changed rainfall patterns created water stress in some years and flooding in others. New pests and diseases, previously limited by cold winters, began appearing in the region. The disruption wasn't just warmer temperatures, but climate instability, more variation, more extremes, less predictability. The champagne industry responded with both adaptation and mitigation. Houses experimented with later picking to preserve acidity, adjusted winemaking techniques to compensate for changing grape characteristics, and explored which areas within the appellation might be better suited to warming conditions. Some began researching whether traditional grape varieties would remain optimal or whether alternative varieties might be necessary in coming decades. The CIVC launched comprehensive climate research programs, modelling how different warming scenarios might affect the region and what adaptations might be required. This research remained largely internal initially, publicly acknowledging climate change as an existential threat risked alarming consumers and inviting regulatory attention. But by 2015, the industry had accepted that climate change wasn't a distant possibility, but a present reality requiring immediate response. Perhaps most significantly, climate change forced Champagne to confront a philosophical question. If warming made champagne easier to cultivate, if ripeness became routine rather than challenging, would champagne lose the distinctive character that came from marginal climate conditions? The very difficulty that had shaped champagne's identity might disappear, and with it, some of what made champagne special. The organic revolution environmental consciousness, which had emerged tentatively in the 1990s, accelerated dramatically in the 2000s. Organic and biodynamic viticulture moved from fringe practice to mainstream conversation, driven by consumer demand, regulatory pressure, and genuine commitment to sustainability. The conversion was neither easy nor universal. Champagne's high vine density, humid climate, and disease pressure made organic viticulture challenging. Foregoing chemical fungicides meant accepting higher risk of mildew and rot, potentially devastating in wet years. In a region where every hectare was worth hundreds of thousands of euros, the stakes were enormous. Yet a growing number of producers made the conversion successfully. Pioneers like Leclerc Bryant, Fleury, and L'Armandier Bernier demonstrated that organic and biodynamic methods could produce exceptional champagne while improving soil health and biodiversity. Their success encouraged others to experiment, and by 2015, hundreds of producers had achieved organic certification or were in conversion. The movement represented more than environmental ethics. It was part of a broader shift toward terroir expression and authenticity. Organic viticulture required deeper attention to individual vineyards, responding to specific conditions rather than applying standardized treatments. This aligned with the growing emphasis on single vineyard champagnes and site-specific production. The Grande Maison approached organic conversion more cautiously. With thousands of hectares under management and contracts with hundreds of growers, system-wide conversion was enormously complex. But many began reducing chemical inputs, implementing sustainable practices, and setting long-term targets for organic conversion. LVMH announced ambitious environmental goals across its portfolio. Taittinger committed to converting significant vineyard holdings to organic management. Critics questioned whether large-scale industrial viticulture could ever be truly sustainable, regardless of certification. They argued that the concentration of vineyard ownership, the emphasis on yields and consistency, and the corporate structure of major houses fundamentally conflicted with organic principles. The debate highlighted tensions between champagne's artisanal image and industrial reality. By 2015, organic and biodynamic champagnes occupied a significant niche market. They commanded premium prices and enjoyed critical acclaim. More importantly, they had shifted the entire industry's conversation about viticulture, making sustainability a competitive advantage rather than a costly concession. Terroir's triumph. The early 21st century saw an explosion of interest in terroir-driven champagnes. Single vineyard bottlings, single vintage releases, and LUDIT designations proliferated. Producers began emphasizing not just where their champagne came from in a general sense, but the specific plots, slopes, and soils that shaped its character. This represented a philosophical revolution. Traditional champagne had been about blending, combining grapes from multiple sites and vintages to achieve consistency. The goal was a recognizable house style that tasted the same year after year. Terroir-focused producers inverted this logic. They wanted their champagnes to taste different depending on origin and vintage, expressing place rather than style. The movement was driven partly by grower producers seeking to differentiate themselves from Grande Maisons. If your competitive advantage was controlling your own vineyards, emphasizing terroir made sense. But it also reflected genuine belief that Champagne's geological and climatic diversity created meaningful differences in wine character that blending obscured. producers began mapping their vineyards meticulously, identifying parcels with distinct characteristics. They vinified these separately, bottling them individually rather than blending them into house cuvées. They experimented with indigenous yeasts, minimal dosage, extended aging, and other techniques that allowed terroir to express itself more clearly. Critics argued this was a marketing strategy as much as a philosophical commitment, that terroir had become a premium-priced buzzword. They questioned whether most consumers could actually taste meaningful differences between single vineyard champagnes or were simply responding to romantic narratives about place. But blind tastings increasingly demonstrated that terroir differences were real and discernible. Champagnes from chalk-rich Côte de Blancs tasted demonstrably different from those from clay-heavy Montagne de Reims. Specific lieux-dits within villages showed distinctive characteristics. The question wasn't whether terroir existed, but how much it mattered relative to winemaking decisions. The terroir movement created space for smaller producers to compete on quality and distinctiveness, rather than brand recognition and marketing budgets. It also enriched champagne culture, providing diversity and discovery for sophisticated consumers. By 2015, terroir had become central to how serious champagne enthusiasts understood and appreciated the category. Hip-hop's golden bottles. In 2006, Frédéric Rousseau, managing director of Louis Roederer, maker of Cristal, made comments in a magazine interview that were perceived as dismissive of hip-hop culture's embrace of his brand. The backlash was swift and severe. Jay-Z announced a boycott of Cristal, and the broader hip-hop community followed. Within months, Cristal had lost its dominant position in hip-hop, luxury culture. The incident highlighted how profoundly hip-hop had influenced champagne consumption and culture. Since the 1990s, rappers had name-dropped champagne brands in lyrics, featured bottles in music videos, and made champagne central to hip-hop's aesthetic of success and celebration. But the relationship had always been complicated. Champagne brands benefited from the exposure, but worried about association with a culture that luxury consumers might perceive as incompatible with traditional elegance. The Cristal controversy created an opportunity. Jay-Z partnered with Champagne Cartier to develop Armand de Brignac, marketed specifically to hip-hop culture with distinctive gold bottles and premium pricing. Ace of Spades, as it became known, embraced rather than tolerated hip-hop's champagne enthusiasm. Other brands followed, recognizing that hip-hop culture represented not just a market segment, but a cultural force that shaped luxury consumption globally. The hip-hop champagne phenomenon was significant beyond sales figures. It demonstrated champagne's adaptability, that a product associated with French aristocracy and European elegance could become central to a distinctly American, African-American urban culture. It showed that champagne's meaning wasn't fixed, but constantly being remade by those who consumed it. It also highlighted generational and cultural divides within champagne marketing. In 2023, Champagne shipped approximately 299 million bottles globally, a figure that would have seemed impossible a century earlier, but now represents careful calibration rather than maximum capacity. The region could produce more, much more, but chooses constraint over expansion. This deliberate scarcity, maintained through coordinated regulation, defines modern champagne as much as terroir or tradition. Yet beneath the surface of managed prosperity, the region faces pressures that threaten not just profits, but identity itself. The numbers tell part of the story. 300 million bottles annually translates to roughly 40 bottles per second, every second, year-round. The scale is industrial, massive pressing facilities, kilometres of underground cellars, automated riddling systems, production lines that bottle thousands per hour. Yet the narrative remains artisanal, hand harvesting, small family vineyards, centuries of tradition. Both are true, and the tension between them defines contemporary champagne. Production is concentrated among relatively few houses. The top 20 producers account for nearly 70% of total volume, with LVMH alone representing almost 20% through its portfolio of brands: Moet and Chandon, Veuve Clicquot, Krug, Dom Perignon, Ruinart. This concentration has intensified over recent years through continued consolidation and acquisition, yet diversity persists. More than 15,000 growers cultivate the region's 34,000 hectares of vines. Approximately 4,400 of these growers produce their own champagne rather than selling grapes to houses. These smaller producers represent less than 30% of volume, but a disproportionate share of innovation and critical attention. The contemporary landscape accommodates both industrial giants and artisanal operations, each serving different markets and embodying different values. The economics remain extraordinary. Vineyard land in Grand Cru villages commands prices exceeding £1.5 million per hectare, among the highest agricultural land values globally. Grapes from these vineyards sell for 8 to 10 per kilogram, multiple times the price of grapes for ordinary wine. A bottle of non-vintage champagne retails for 30 to 50, while prestige cuvées command 150 to 300 pounds, or considerably more. The entire industry generates approximately $5 billion in annual revenue, supporting directly or indirectly most of the region's 300,000 residents. These numbers reflect Champagne's success in maintaining premium positioning despite massive scale, but they also reveal vulnerability. The entire system depends on maintaining price levels that justify astronomical land values and sustain operations with high fixed costs. Any significant disruption to demand or reputation could cascade through the region catastrophically. Climate adaptation becomes urgent. By 2024, climate change had moved from future concern to present crisis. Average temperatures in Champagne have risen 1.2 degrees since 1950, with acceleration in recent years. Harvest now begins in late August rather than late September. Heat waves occur regularly. Extreme weather events, devastating frosts in 2017 and 2021, severe hail, unprecedented droughts, damage vineyards and destroy crops with increasing frequency. The viticultural implications are profound. Higher temperatures increase sugar accumulation and reduce acidity, threatening Champagne's characteristic freshness. Earlier ripening compresses the growing season, leaving less time for flavour development. Changing precipitation patterns create water stress, new pests and diseases that couldn't survive. Historical climate conditions now thrive. The response has been multifaceted and urgent. Houses and growers are experimenting with adaptation techniques that would have been heretical a generation ago. Some are testing rootstocks that handle heat and drought better. Others are exploring canopy management techniques that shade grapes from excessive sun. Still others are considering whether traditional grape varieties will remain optimal or whether heat-tolerant alternatives might become necessary. Most controversially, the region is exploring expansion into new areas. The AOC boundaries were drawn based on historical climate patterns that no longer apply. Areas that were once too cold for quality grape production might now be ideal, while historically premier sites might become too warm. In 2023, the CIVC announced it was studying potential expansion zones in cooler, higher elevation areas within the existing department boundaries. This prospect generates fierce debate. Expansion could provide insurance against warming, offering cooler sites as traditional areas become suboptimal. But it also risks diluting what champagne means. If the boundaries expand dramatically, does champagne remain rooted in specific terroir or become a movable designation following favourable climate? More fundamentally, climate adaptation forces champagne to confront what makes it distinctive. If warmth makes ripening easy, if traditional challenges disappear, does champagne become just another wine region? The marginal climate that shaped champagne's character for centuries is vanishing. What replaces it might produce excellent sparkling wine, but will it be champagne in any meaningful sense? Research is intensive. The CIVC has invested millions in climate studies, agricultural experiments, and long-term planning. Individual houses conduct their own research, testing techniques and preparing for scenarios ranging from manageable adaptation to fundamental transformation. Yet uncertainty pervades these efforts. Climate models project continued warming, but specific regional effects remain unpredictable. The champagne of 2050 or 2075 might be profoundly different from what exists today, and no one knows exactly how. The sustainability imperative environmental consciousness has evolved from niche concern to industry-wide priority. By 2024, sustainability certifications have proliferated. Organic, biodynamic, haute valeur environnementale, HVE, viticulture, durable, en champagne, VDC. Major houses have announced ambitious targets for carbon neutrality, reduced chemical inputs, and biodiversity protection. The commitment is partly genuine and partly strategic. Consumer demand for sustainable products is strong and growing, particularly among younger buyers. Regulations are tightening, with the European Union imposing increasingly strict environmental requirements. Climate change itself makes sustainability necessary. Degraded soils and damaged ecosystems reduce resilience to extreme weather. Moet Hennessy committed to 100% organic certification across all vineyards by 2030. A massive undertaking involving thousands of hectares and hundreds of contracted growers. Telmont launched as a sustainability-focused brand within the LVMH portfolio, emphasising minimal packaging and environmental stewardship. Dozens of smaller houses converted to organic or biodynamic viticulture, often highlighting their environmental practices as competitive differentiation. Yet sustainability faces practical limits. Champagne's humid climate and disease pressure make organic viticulture challenging, especially at scale. Wet years require intensive intervention to prevent mildew and rot. Foregoing chemical treatments can mean losing significant portions of the crop. Small producers can manage this risk, but houses producing millions of bottles need reliability. Additionally, sustainability extends beyond viniculture. Glass bottles are heavy and energy intensive to produce and transport. Shipping champagne globally generates substantial carbon emissions. Maintaining reserve stocks in temperature-controlled cellars requires energy. True sustainability would require rethinking not just vineyard practices, but the entire business model, and threatening elements that define champagne's identity and economics. The industry is navigating this tension by pursuing incremental improvements while maintaining core practices. Lighter bottles reduce transportation emissions without changing the product. Solar panels on winery roofs generate renewable energy without altering production methods. Organic viticulture proceeds where feasible, while conventional methods continue where necessary. Critics argue this is greenwashing, marketing sustainability while avoiding fundamental changes that might reduce profitability. Defenders counter that incremental progress is realistic and meaningful, that perfect sustainability is impossible at champagne's scale, and that the industry is doing more than most luxury categories. The debate reflects broader tensions about whether capitalism can genuinely address environmental crisis or whether it can only perform concern while protecting profits. Tourism transforms the region. Champagne has become one of France's premier tourism destinations, welcoming approximately 3 million visitors annually by 2024. The transformation from agricultural region to tourist attraction accelerated dramatically in recent years, driven by UNESCO World Heritage designation of vineyards and cellars in 2015, and by strategic investment in visitor infrastructure. The Grande Maisons offer elaborate experiences. Moet and Chandon receives hundreds of thousands of visitors yearly at its Épernay headquarters, offering tours of historic cellars and tastings in luxury tasting rooms. Smaller houses provide intimate visits, often with owner winemakers personally guiding guests. Grower producers have open tasting rooms, some simple and rustic, others architecturally ambitious. Tourism generates significant revenue. Visitor spending approaches $300 million annually, but also creates challenges. Historic villages struggle with traffic and parking. Housing prices have escalated, making it difficult for workers to live near their jobs. The authentic character that attracts visitors risks being displaced by tourism itself, replaced by tasting rooms and boutiques where homes and shops once stood. More subtly, tourism changes how Champagne understands itself. When millions visit annually, the region becomes partly a theme park of itself, performing authentic Champagne culture for audiences expecting specific experiences. This isn't necessarily negative. Many visitors develop genuine appreciation and become lifelong customers, but it adds another layer of complexity to Champagne's identity. The pandemic temporarily devastated tourism, with international travel restrictions and health concerns keeping visitors away. Recovery has been strong, but patterns have shifted. Domestic French tourism increased while some international markets remain below pre-pandemic levels. The experience revealed both tourism's economic importance and the industry's vulnerability to disruptions in mobility and hospitality. The Prosecco problem. While Champagne obsesses over quality and sustainability, Prosecco has quietly become the world's best-selling sparkling wine by volume, surpassing Champagne significantly. Prosecco's success represents everything Champagne isn't: inexpensive, casual, approachable, produced at massive scale with minimal aging requirements. The contrast is instructive. Prosecco costs 5 to 10 pounds per bottle retail, compared to Champagne's 30 to 50 minimum. It positions itself as everyday drinking rather than special occasions. Production has exploded in recent years, with Prosecco Dossi producing over 600 million bottles annually, double Champagne's output. Champagne's response has been primarily dismissive. Prosecco isn't competition because it serves a completely different market segment. Consumers choosing £7 Prosecco were never going to buy £40 Champagne. The products are substitutes only in the loosest sense. Both sparkle, both come from wine regions with geographic protections, but the similarities end there. Yet Prosecco's success raises uncomfortable questions. If consumers want affordable, sparkling wine for casual consumption, and Prosecco satisfies that desire effectively, what role does Champagne play? Must it remain exclusively expensive and reserved for special occasions? Can it find ways to be more accessible without sacrificing premium positioning? Some houses have explored entry-level offerings, simplified packaging, or smaller bottle sizes to reduce barriers to consumption. Others have doubled down on luxury positioning, arguing that Champagne's future lies in moving upmarket rather than down. The tension reflects broader uncertainty about luxury categories in an era of wealth inequality and changing consumer values. Cava, Spain's method champenoise sparkling wine, presents a different challenge. Often higher quality than Prosecco, but still considerably cheaper than Champagne, Cava occupies a middle ground. Its existence proves that traditional method sparkling wine can be produced well and affordably, raising questions about what exactly justifies Champagne's premium beyond terroir and reputation. Generation Z drinks differently. Younger consumers approach alcohol generally, and champagne specifically, with different attitudes than previous generations. They drink less frequently, but seek higher quality when they do drink. They value authenticity, sustainability, and social responsibility over traditional luxury signals. They're skeptical of marketing and seek genuine stories and transparent practices. These preferences create both challenges and opportunities for Champagne. On one hand, Generation Z's reduced alcohol consumption threatens volume. Champagne's history is not a straight line from accident to triumph, but a tangled narrative of crisis and adaptation, disaster and reinvention, failure transformed into success through persistence, creativity, and collective action. Looking across 4 centuries, patterns emerge, lessons not just about wine, but about how value is created, how identity is constructed, how communities survive disruption, and how tradition and innovation coexist. These lessons resonate far beyond sparkling wine, offering insights about brands, terroir, resilience, and the relationship between place and product in an increasingly globalized and rapidly changing world. The accident as advantage. Champagne's foundational lesson is deceptively simple. What appears as failure can become signature. The bubbles that 17th century winemakers tried desperately to eliminate became the defining characteristic that made Champagne the world's most celebrated wine. This wasn't inevitable. It required recognizing potential in malfunction, seeing opportunity in accident, and having the courage to embrace what seemed like a flaw. The transformation wasn't immediate or obvious. For decades, Champagne's fizz was a problem to be solved. Bottles exploded, wine was lost, storage was dangerous. Only when English merchants and adventurous French houses began deliberately creating and controlling the sparkle did accident become advantage. The shift required technical innovation, stronger bottles, effective closures, controlled fermentation. But more fundamentally, it required a conceptual revolution, redefining Champagne's identity around its most distinctive and problematic characteristic. This pattern recurs throughout Champagne's history. Phylloxera, which devastated vineyards, forced modernization and scientific viticulture. The riots of 1927, born of violent conflict, led to the cooperative structures that created stability and prosperity. Climate change, currently threatening the region, is driving innovation in viticulture and winemaking that may ultimately produce better wines. The lesson extends beyond Champagne. In any field, what distinguishes a product or place often begins as a limitation or accident that, through creative response, becomes a defining advantage. The constraint becomes the signature, the bug becomes the feature, the liability transforms into the asset. But this transformation isn't automatic. It requires recognition, courage, and often technical mastery to control what was initially uncontrollable. Champagne teaches that identity isn't found but made, constructed through decisions about what to emphasize and how to frame it. The fizz was always there. Making it Champagne's essence was a choice, one that required seeing possibility rather than merely problem. Collective action creates value. Perhaps Champagne's most profound lesson concerns the power of collective action. Individually, Champagne houses and growers might have failed repeatedly, torn apart by competition, destroyed by conflict, unable to maintain quality or defend their name. Collectively, through institutions like the AOC and CIVC, they created a system that benefits all participants by establishing rules everyone follows. This is extraordinary given the natural tensions. Growers and houses have competing interests. Growers want high grape prices, houses want low costs. Large houses and small producers compete for customers. Traditional families and corporate conglomerates have different values and priorities. These conflicts could have fragmented the industry into warring factions, as happened in other wine regions. Instead, Champagne developed structures that channel conflict into negotiation and coordination. The CIVC brings adversaries together, forces compromise, and enforces agreements. The AOC system protects everyone by protecting the name itself. Collective marketing benefits all producers. Coordinated production management prevents destructive oversupply. The system works because benefits exceed costs. Individual freedom is constrained. You can't plant wherever you want, charge whatever price you choose, or produce however much you can. But in exchange, you get protections, quality assurance, collective marketing, and a share of prestige that would be impossible to create individually. This model challenges conventional wisdom about markets and competition. Economic theory often assumes that unfettered competition produces optimal outcomes, that regulation distorts markets, that collective action enables harmful cartels. Champagne demonstrates that coordinated action can create value that competition alone cannot, that strategic cooperation within competitive markets can benefit producers and consumers simultaneously. The lesson applies far beyond wine. Any industry where reputation matters collectively, where individual actions affect others, where long-term sustainability requires coordination, can learn from Champagne's model. The challenge is creating institutions strong enough to enforce cooperation, but democratic enough to maintain legitimacy. A balanced Champagne has maintained imperfectly but effectively for nearly a century. Marketing luxury without losing authenticity, Champagne has mastered a paradox that confounds most luxury brands, maintaining authenticity while aggressively marketing. The region has spent billions promoting Champagne, associating it with celebrities, glamour, and aspiration. Yet it has largely avoided seeming fake, manufactured, or merely commercial. The product still feels rooted in place, connected to tradition, made by people who care about quality rather than just profit. This achievement required careful balance. The marketing emphasizes heritage, craftsmanship, and terroir, elements that are genuine, while creating aspirational associations through celebrity and luxury contexts. The Grands Maisons can advertise extensively because the underlying story is true. Champagne really does come from a specific place, really is made with care and expertise, really does have centuries of tradition. Critically, Champagne maintains authenticity through quality. The marketing promises excellence and the product delivers. AOC regulations ensure minimum standards. Houses compete on quality as much as image. Even inexpensive Champagne meets criteria that protect the category's reputation. The marketing amplifies truth rather than replacing it. The grower-producer movement reinforces authenticity from another direction. While Grandes Maisons promote glamour and luxury, small vignerons offer intimacy and craft. Both are authentic. Champagne really does include both industrial giants and family producers, mass market brands and artisanal specialties. The diversity itself feels genuine because it reflects reality. The lesson is that luxury marketing succeeds when it amplifies rather than contradicts underlying truth. If a product is genuinely special, made with care, rooted in place, crafted with expertise, marketing can celebrate those qualities without undermining them. But if marketing creates associations disconnected from reality, authenticity erodes and consumers eventually recognize the disconnect. Champagne also teaches that authenticity isn't fixed but constructed and maintained. The traditions Champagne celebrates are real, but which traditions to emphasize, how to present them, which stories to tell, these are choices. Authenticity requires truth, but also curation, selection, framing. It's genuine and performs simultaneously, a reality that marketing shapes without inventing. Tradition and innovation as partners, Champagne's 4-century history demonstrates that tradition and innovation aren't opposing forces, but complementary necessities. The method champenoise is traditional, secondary fermentation in the bottle, manual riddling, extended aging. Yet it was once revolutionary, developed through experimentation and technical advancement. What's traditional now was innovative then. This pattern repeats continuously. Dom Perignon's improvements to winemaking were innovations that became traditions. Veuve Clicquot's riddling table revolutionized production and is now historical practice. The AOC system was radical when established, now is foundational tradition. Sustainable viticulture challenges current practices, but will eventually become the traditional way things are done. The key is that innovations succeed when they serve tradition's underlying goals. Riddling tables didn't abandon Champagne's character. They improved efficiency while maintaining quality. AOC regulations didn't reject Champagne's identity. They protected and formalized it. Climate adaptation doesn't discard terroir. It attempts to preserve terroir expression under changing conditions. Failed innovations are those that break rather than honor the connection between place, product, and identity. Proposals to allow non-traditional grape varieties solely for economic reasons, or to relax aging requirements for faster inventory turnover, threaten what makes Champagne distinctive. They prioritize short-term profit over long-term value preservation. Champagne teaches that tradition isn't static preservation, but dynamic continuation. Keeping alive the essential while adapting the peripheral, maintaining identity while evolving practice, honoring the past while preparing for the future. This requires distinguishing between core principles and historical accidents, between what defines Champagne and what merely characterized it in the specific eras. The balance is delicate and contentious. Every innovation faces resistance from those who see change as betrayal. Every tradition faces criticism from those who see it as obstacle to progress. Champagne navigates this tension through institutions that require consensus, through processes that make change gradual rather than sudden, through culture that respects past while accepting that survival requires adaptation. Geographic specificity as economic moat. Champagne's value derives fundamentally from its geographic specificity. Only grapes from certain communes, grown in specific soil, under particular climate conditions, can become Champagne. This creates scarcity that cannot be overcome through competition or innovation. No amount of investment can create Champagne elsewhere, because Champagne is defined by place. This is the power of terroir, not just as concept, but as economic structure. Geographic indications convert location into value, transforming land into irreplaceable asset. The chalk soil of Champagne isn't inherently more valuable than soil elsewhere, but because only this soil produces Champagne grapes, it commands extraordinary prices. The system works because it's legally protected and culturally accepted. AOC regulations give geographic designation force of law. International treaties extend protections across borders. Consumers recognize and value the distinction, willing to pay premiums for authentic champagne over imitations. But geographic specificity creates value only when coupled with quality and reputation. Simply declaring that products from a specific place are special doesn't make them so. Champagne's geographic value rests on centuries of quality demonstration, marketing investment, and reputation building. The terroir provides distinctiveness, but human effort converts distinctiveness into value. The lesson applies broadly. In an era of globalization and commodification, geographic specificity offers differentiation that can't be copied or outsourced. Products rooted in place, whether wine, cheese, crafts, or agricultural goods, possess inherent scarcity, but converting that scarcity into value requires quality, protection, and marketing that establishes why this place produces something special. Climate change threatens this model profoundly. If the climate that makes champagne distinctive changes fundamentally, does the geographic specificity still create value? If other regions become more suitable for producing champagne method sparkling wine, does champagne's advantage erode? The question tests whether terroir is ultimately about soil and tradition or about climate and conditions, and whether human systems can adapt fast enough when natural systems change. Knowledge transfer across generations. Champagne's continuity across 4 centuries demonstrates the importance of generational knowledge transfer. Techniques for viticulture, winemaking, and aging that took generations to develop are preserved and passed down. Each generation adding refinements while maintaining core practices. This transfer happens formally through education and apprenticeship, but more fundamentally through culture and practice. Children grow up in vineyards, absorbing knowledge unconsciously. Workers spend careers in cellars, developing intuition that can't be taught in classrooms. Families maintain vineyards for generations, accumulating site-specific knowledge about microclimates, soil variations, and optimal practices for specific parcels. The cellar master arrives before dawn, as cellar masters have for generations. The air in the chalk tunnels maintains its constant coolness, 12 degrees, the same temperature that has preserved champagne for centuries. She moves between rows of bottles, thousands upon thousands, tilted in their racks at precise angles. Her hand reaches for a bottle from the 2018 vintage, checking the sediment's position, assessing whether it's ready for the disgorgement. The gesture is ancient, repeated millions of times by workers whose names history forgot, but whose labour built empires from bubbles. Outside, the sun rises over slopes that Romans planted with vines 2,000 years ago. The light catches morning dew on leaves that will become grapes, that will become wine, that will become champagne. A transformation so complex, so dependent on place and tradition and technique, that it seems almost magical, despite being entirely explicable. This is where champagne lives, in the space between dawn ritual and global brand, between individual craft and industrial scale, between ancient terroir and uncertain future. Understanding champagne requires holding these contradictions simultaneously, recognizing that it is both timeless and constantly changing, both rooted in specific earth and sold everywhere, both made by human hands and shaped by forces beyond human control. The journey, from accident to icon, the story that began with Roman legionnaires planting vines near Rheims, has traversed 2 millennia of transformation. Still wines became accidentally sparkling. Regional products became luxury exports. Family enterprises became global brands. Agricultural work became cultural symbol. At each stage, what seemed permanent proved temporary, what seemed accidental became defining, and what appeared as crisis created opportunity. The Romans couldn't have imagined that their practical viticulture, growing grapes where legions were stationed, would found an industry that would outlast their empire by 15 centuries. Medieval monks cultivating vineyards for communion wine couldn't have foreseen that their site selections would become real estate worth millions per hectare. Dom Perignon, trying to eliminate bubbles from wine, couldn't have predicted that those troublesome fizzes would become the defining characteristic of the world's most celebrated drink. Each era brought transformations that contemporaries experienced as disruption, but that history reveals as evolution. The méthode champenoise, developed painfully over decades, became tradition. The grandes maisons, built by entrepreneurial merchants, became institutions. The AOC system, forged from violent conflict, became foundation. Climate change, currently threatening terroir, will likely become another transformation that future historians describe as adaptation rather than catastrophe. The pattern across these transformations is consistent. Champagne survives not through resistance, but through embracing change, while maintaining identity. The product that emerged from each crisis was different from what preceded it, yet recognisably champagne. The region that rebuilt after each war or epidemic or market collapse was altered but continuous. The industry that adapted to each challenge retained its core purpose, making wine that sparkles from grapes grown in specific soil under particular conditions according to established methods. This journey reveals champagne's essential nature, not as fixed thing, but as living tradition, constantly remade while maintaining connection to place and practice. The champagne made today differs profoundly from that of 1824 or 1924, yet it remains champagne. The question for the next century is whether this pattern of adaptive continuity can persist when the fundamental conditions, climate most critically, are changing at unprecedented speed. The core transformation, problem to prestige. If one pattern defines champagne's history, it's the transformation of problem into prestige. The bubbles were initially a flaw to be eliminated. The marginal climate made grape growing difficult. The fragile bottles exploded catastrophically. The remote location complicated commerce. Every apparent disadvantage became, through human ingenuity and persistence, the foundation for value. This transformation required more than clever marketing. It required solving genuine technical problems, creating bottles that could withstand pressure, developing closures that maintained carbonation, perfecting fermentation control that made bubbles predictable rather than random. It required legal innovation, establishing geographic protections, creating collective institutions, defining quality standards. It required cultural work, associating champagne with celebration and luxury, making it meaningful beyond its material properties. Most fundamentally, the transformation required recognizing that limitations could become distinctions. The marginal climate that made ripening uncertain created high acidity and delicate flavors that became champagne's signature. The scarcity imposed by geography became the foundation for premium pricing. The complexity of production became proof of craftsmanship worth paying for. This lesson resonates beyond champagne. In any field, distinctive value often emerges from constraint rather than abundance, from what makes something difficult rather than easy. But constraint becomes advantage only when coupled with excellence. If champagne were merely difficult to make, but not exceptional in quality, the constraint would simply be limitation. The transformation from problem to prestige requires that difficulty produces distinctiveness worth valuing. Climate change threatens to undo this transformation by removing the constraint. If warming makes champagne's climate less marginal, if ripening becomes routine, if the difficulty that shaped character disappears, does champagne lose what makes it special? The question tests whether champagne's value ultimately derives from terroir or from reputation, whether it's rooted in earth or in brand. The answer is likely both, and that dual foundation creates both resilience and vulnerability. Reputation built over centuries provides momentum that transcends immediate conditions, but reputation divorced from distinctive quality eventually erodes. Champagne must somehow preserve distinctiveness as conditions change, finding new ways to convert limitation into advantage, even as historical limitations disappear. Climate change, the existential question. No challenge in Champagne's history compares to climate change for combining inevitability, severity, and fundamental threat to identity. Wars end, epidemics pass, economic cycles turn. Climate change at current trajectories will continue accelerating for decades regardless of human response, altering the conditions that made Champagne unique in ways that may be irreversible within meaningful timescales. The region is already adapting. Harvest dates have shifted 2 weeks earlier. Viticulture practices have evolved to manage warmer conditions. Winemaking techniques adjust for riper grapes and lower acidity. These adaptations are working. Recent vintages demonstrate that quality can be maintained and even enhanced under warmer conditions. But adaptation has limits. If temperatures rise another 2 degrees, as projections suggest is likely by mid-century, the climate that shaped Champagne's character will have changed fundamentally. The grape varieties currently planted may no longer be optimal. The sites historically prized for quality may become too warm. The freshness and elegance that define Champagne's style may require techniques that feel like manipulation rather than expression of terroir. The most radical adaptation being considered is geographic expansion, planting vineyards in areas currently outside AOC boundaries, in higher elevations or more northerly locations where climate might resemble historical Champagne. This makes viticultural sense but threatens philosophical foundations. If Champagne can move to follow favourable climate, is it still meaningfully rooted in place? Does terroir become a movable designation rather than a fixed one? These questions have no easy answers. They force Champagne to confront what terroir means when climate changes faster than vines can adapt, what tradition means when traditional practices no longer work, what Champagne means when the conditions that created it no longer exist. Yet history suggests grounds for measured optimism. Champagne has faced existential threats before. Phylloxera could have ended viticulture entirely. Wars could have destroyed the industry permanently. Economic collapses could have eliminated the market. Each time, adaptation proved possible while maintaining identity. Climate change is more profound than these challenges, but the capacity for adaptive transformation remains. The Champagne of 2075 will almost certainly be different from today's Champagne, made from different grape varieties in different locations using different techniques. The question is whether those differences will be recognised as evolution of Champagne or as transformation into something else. The answer depends on whether the industry can maintain the connection to place, commitment to quality, and cultural meaning that transcends specific practices or conditions. Generational transitions across Champagne. A quiet revolution is occurring as leadership of family houses passes from one generation to the next. The transition brings fresh perspectives, but also risks breaking knowledge transfer chains that have sustained quality and tradition. The new generation faces unprecedented challenges. They inherit businesses worth millions, but also responsibility for adapting to climate change, meeting sustainability demands, navigating digital marketing, and maintaining relevance for consumers with different values than previous generations. They must honour family legacy while recognising that survival requires change. Some embrace innovation aggressively, experimenting with organic viticulture, reducing dosage levels, exploring single vineyard bottlings, engaging with natural wine movements. Others prioritise continuity, maintaining house styles, respecting established practices, changing incrementally rather than dramatically. Both approaches reflect legitimate responses to contemporary challenges. The transition is complicated by economic pressures. Family houses face estate taxes, capital requirements for modernisation, and competition from luxury conglomerates with deeper resources. Many families sell to larger entities, ending generations of independence. This consolidation brings efficiency and capital, but potentially reduces diversity and independence that enrich champagne culture. Yet the generational transition also brings vitality. Young winemakers and viticulturalists, trained scientifically but respecting tradition, apply new knowledge to old practices. They question assumptions, experiment with techniques, engage global conversations about sustainability and quality. They connect champagne to contemporary culture while maintaining its distinctive character. The successful transitions are those that balance continuity and change, respecting what predecessors built while adapting to new realities, maintaining quality standards while exploring new expressions, honouring tradition while embracing innovation. This balance defines champagne's adaptive capacity and will determine whether family houses remain vibrant contributors or become nostalgic relics. The mass luxury paradox. Champagne produces 300 million bottles annually, industrial scale by any measure, yet it maintains positioning as luxury product, symbol of special occasions, marker of prestige. Managing this paradox, being simultaneously mass market and exclusive, requires sophisticated strategies that balance accessibility and scarcity. The pyramid structure serves this purpose. Entry-level champagnes provide access at relatively affordable prices, though still premium compared to other wines. Mid-tier offerings provide quality upgrades for serious occasions. Prestige cuvées at the apex maintain exclusivity and aspiration. This segmentation allows champagne to serve different markets and price points while maintaining overall premium positioning. But the paradox creates tensions. Making champagne too accessible risks cheapening the brand. Making it too exclusive limits volume and cultural relevance. Finding the balance requires constant calibration through pricing strategies, distribution controls, marketing that emphasizes special occasion usage even for entry-level products. The grower-producer movement provides another resolution. While grandes maisons pursue volume, small producers offer exclusivity and authenticity at different price points. The coexistence of industrial and artisanal approaches within the champagne umbrella allows the category to serve diverse consumers with different values. Yet younger consumers increasingly question luxury consumption generally. Generation Z's reduced alcohol consumption, emphasis on sustainability, and skepticism toward traditional status symbols threaten champagne's cultural relevance. The industry responds by emphasizing quality, craftsmanship, and sustainability rather than merely prestige, by creating experiences rather than just selling products, by connecting to values beyond price and exclusivity,